Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, all that stuff, it never really scared me. I was the type who'd laugh at horror movies and roll my eyes at tales of bumps in the night. That is, until last winter, when I had an experience that changed everything I thought I knew. It was just after New Year's, and my friends and I had rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was one of those isolated spots with no cell service, a perfect place to disconnect and enjoy some time away from the city. The cabin itself was cozy, rustic, with a big stone fireplace and large windows that overlooked the snow-covered forest. It was supposed to be the perfect escape. The first night went exactly as planned. We drank, played games, and swapped stories late into the night. There were 6 of us: myself, my girlfriend Emily, our friends Ben and Sarah, and another couple, Jason and Hannah. We were all in high spirits, glad to be away from our usual routines. Around midnight, the snow started falling heavily, big fluffy flakes that piled up quickly, blanketing the ground outside. It was about 2 a.m. when we finally decided to call it a night. Emily and I took the bedroom on the first floor, while the others headed upstairs. The fire had died down, leaving the living room dimly lit by the glowing embers. We crawled into bed, and I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside our room. At first, I thought it was one of the others getting up for a late-night snack or a bathroom break. But as the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, I realized something felt off. They were too heavy, too methodical. Nothing like the shuffling steps of a sleepy person. I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. I nudged Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened, her face scrunching in confusion as the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth. "Maybe it's Ben," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. I got up, careful not to make any noise, and crept to the door. I opened it just a crack, enough to peer into the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers in the living room. But I didn't see anyone. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" I called out softly, but there was no response. Just silence. I stepped into the hallway, looking left and right. Nothing. The cabin was quiet. I checked the other rooms downstairs, but they were empty. I even peeked out the front window. The snow was still falling heavily, undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of anyone outside. I went back to bed, brushing it off as maybe my imagination or the house settling. But Emily and I lay there, listening for any further sounds. Nothing. Eventually, we both drifted back to sleep. The next morning, we all gathered for breakfast, and I brought up the footsteps. To my surprise, Ben and Sarah exchanged uneasy looks. "You heard it too?" Ben asked, a nervous edge to his voice. "We thought it was one of you." We all compared notes and realized that none of us had been up during the night. Jason suggested it was probably the house creaking, but Ben shook his head. "No, it was footsteps. They stopped right outside our door, then just turned around." That should have been enough to send us packing, but we laughed it off. We were here to have fun, and no one wanted to be the one to admit they were scared of a few unexplained noises. So we spent the day hiking, playing in the snow, and trying to ignore the lingering sense of unease. That night, after another evening of games and drinks, we all turned in. Emily and I snuggled under the covers, trying to keep warm despite the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. We had just started to drift off when I heard it again. The footsteps, heavy and slow, moving through the hallway. I bolted upright, my pulse quickening. Emily sat up beside me, her eyes wide. "There it is again," she whispered, gripping my arm. This time, I wasn't going to sit around and wonder. I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to cut through the darkness as I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light swept across the walls, revealing nothing but the familiar wooden panels. The footsteps stopped the moment I stepped out, and the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. "Who's out there?" I called, louder this time. I heard the others stirring upstairs, footsteps hurrying down the creaky stairs. Ben appeared at the top of the staircase, looking down at me. "You heard it again, didn't you?" he asked, his voice tense. I nodded. It was right here, in the hallway, but there's no one here. Sarah and Jason joined us, their faces pale. We searched the cabin again, room by room, checking every window and door. Everything was locked tight, the snow outside still untouched. No signs of anyone else around. We were all on edge now, a tension growing that we couldn't quite shake. We tried to go back to bed, but it was useless. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, set us on edge. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. But the rest of the night was silent. The following day, the tension between us was palpable. We decided to cut the trip short, packing our bags and tidying up the cabin. As we were getting ready to leave, Sarah called out from the living room. "Guys, you need to see this." We all hurried over, finding her standing by the large picture window that overlooked the front yard. She pointed to the snow outside, and my heart sank. There, in the fresh, undisturbed snow, was a single set of footprints leading up to the front door. The prints were large, too big to belong to any of us, and they stopped abruptly at the entrance, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. We all exchanged uneasy glances. No one had been outside since the snow had started falling, and we hadn't seen anyone approach the cabin. It was like the footprints had appeared out of nowhere, perfectly preserved in the snow. Jason tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's just an animal," he suggested, though his voice wavered. But we all knew those weren't animal tracks. They were too clear, too human. We packed up quickly after that, piling into our cars and heading back to the city without another word. No one wanted to talk about what we had seen or heard. It was easier to pretend it was nothing, just a weird coincidence. But deep down, I think we all knew something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained. A few days later, I got a call from the rental company. They were just checking to see how our stay was, if everything had gone okay. I hesitated before asking if they'd had any other complaints about the cabin. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment, then she sighed. "You're not the first to mention strange noises," she said. "Some guests say they hear footsteps or voices, but we've never found anything. The cabin's been there for decades, though, so who knows? Old places like that, they have a way of keeping secrets." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a chill run down my spine. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps and the way they'd seemed so deliberate, so purposeful. And the footprints in the snow, where had they come from? And more importantly, where had they gone? I still don't have answers, and maybe I never will. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my apartment, I swear I hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my door. And each time I hold my breath, waiting for the sound to stop, or worse, for it to come inside. I've always been an avid hiker. There's something about being out in nature that clears my head, like the world falls away and it's just me, the trees, and the sound of my own footsteps. I'd tackled all the usual trails near my town, so when I heard about a more remote hike, one that supposedly led to a beautiful hidden waterfall, I couldn't resist. It wasn't on any official map, just a spot that local hikers whispered about. "It's easy to get lost," they'd warn, but I figured I could handle it. I wasn't afraid of a challenge. I set out early on a crisp autumn morning, armed with my backpack, a thermos of coffee, and my trusty old map that I'd scribbled directions on. The first part of the trail was familiar enough, well-trodden and marked with faded signs. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less defined, branches clawing at my clothes and the underbrush thickening with every step. I was determined, though. I could hear the faint rush of water in the distance, urging me onward. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail, One path was marked with an old, weathered sign pointing back to town, and the other, barely more than a deer trail, twisted into the dense woods. I paused, consulting my notes. The directions were vague, just a few cryptic hints about landmarks. A gnarled oak tree, a moss-covered boulder. I glanced around, spotting what I thought was the oak in question. I took a deep breath and chose the unmarked path. The forest grew darker as I went, the canopy overhead thickening until it blocked out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional creak of a distant branch. The deeper I went, the more I started to second-guess my decision. The trees all looked the same, and the trail had long since disappeared into the tangle of roots and ferns. I pulled out my phone to check the time and my location, but there was no signal. The GPS map was useless, just a blue dot floating in a sea of green. I told myself to stay calm. I had enough supplies, and I could always backtrack if I needed to. I pressed on, hoping the waterfall was just around the next bend. But it wasn't. I walked for what felt like hours, the sound of rushing water never growing any closer. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning like tall, silent sentinels. That's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, scanning the dense undergrowth. But there was nothing there. Just shadows playing tricks, I told myself. I kept walking, but my pace quickened, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. The sense of unease grew, a gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. But every time I stopped and listened, there was only silence. My mind raced with possibilities, a bear, a wolf, maybe even another lost hiker. But there were no animal sounds, no footprints but my own. Just the unshakable feeling of eyes watching me from the trees. I finally decided to turn back. I was clearly off course, and it was getting late. The sun had dipped below the tree line, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. As I retraced my steps, I realized the way back wasn't as clear as I'd hoped. The trees all looked the same, and every turn felt like it was leading me deeper into the woods. Panic started to set in. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself, but nothing looked right. I cursed under my breath, my fingers trembling as I folded the map back up. That's when I noticed it, a faint trail of footprints in the soft earth leading off to the right. They weren't mine. They were smaller, like those of a child. They looked fresh, barely dusted with fallen leaves. I hesitated. There was no way a child could be out here alone, not this far off the trail. But if there was someone else, maybe they knew the way back. I decided to follow the prints, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of movement. The footprints led me deeper into the forest, winding between trees and over rocks, always just visible enough to keep me on their trail. I followed them for what felt like miles, my anxiety mounting with every step. The forest was darker now, the last of the daylight fading to a dusky blue. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A small, dilapidated cabin nestled between the trees, half hidden by moss and vines. I approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows dark and the wood rotting away. But the footprints led right up to the door where they abruptly stopped. I knocked, my hand shaking slightly as it made contact with the splintered wood. No answer. I pushed the door open and it creaked on rusty hinges, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Inside, the cabin was empty, just a single room with a dirt floor and a few scattered pieces of broken furniture. But what caught my attention was the smell, a damp, musty odor mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. I shined my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the gloom. In the corner, half buried under leaves and debris, I saw it. A small shoe, caked with mud. Next to it, a child's stuffed animal, torn and weathered, its button eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. My blood ran cold. I backed out of the cabin, my mind racing. Who had left those things there? And where were they now? I felt a sudden, overpowering urge to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I turned to go, I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like the whisper of a child's voice carried on the wind. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I scanned the trees, my flashlight flickering as I searched for the source, but there was no one there, just the dark, silent forest. I took off, running blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that cabin, from that voice. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath. I made it back to my car just as the last light of day disappeared completely. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and sped off down the gravel road without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of my apartment, that I let myself breathe. I couldn't get the image of that cabin out of my mind, the small shoe and the torn stuffed animal, the footprints leading up to the door. I tried to find information about missing children in the area, but there was nothing that matched what I'd seen. No reports, no news articles, just silence. A week later, I went back, this time with a friend who knew the area well. I needed to know if what I'd seen was real, if the cabin was really there. We retraced my steps, following my scribbled directions and landmarks. But when we reached the spot where the cabin should have been, there was nothing there. No cabin, no footprints, just an empty clearing surrounded by trees. My friend shrugged it off, but I knew what I'd seen. I still hike, though I've never gone back to that trail. And sometimes when I'm out in the woods, I swear I hear it again. That faint whisper carried on the wind. "Help me?" And every time I quicken my pace, refusing to look back, afraid of what I might see if I do. Afraid that somewhere, deep in those woods, that lost child is still waiting. I've moved a lot in my life, different cities, different apartments. I'm not one to put down roots, but last year when I found a quaint little apartment in a historic building downtown, I thought I'd finally found a place I could settle in for a while. It was one of those old brick buildings with charm, high ceilings, hardwood floors, and big windows that let in just the right amount of sunlight. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the landlord was eager to have me move in. He mentioned the building was undergoing some renovations, but assured me it wouldn't be too disruptive. I didn't mind. I was just happy to have found a place that felt like home. The first few weeks were fine. I spent my days working from home, enjoying the cozy atmosphere. The only odd thing was the noise from upstairs. It sounded like someone moving furniture at all hours of the day and night, scraping, dragging, and the occasional thud. I figured it was just part of the renovations, though I never saw any workers coming or going. It was a little annoying, but I figured it was temporary. One afternoon I ran into my neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Wilkins. She was an elderly woman who'd lived in the building for decades. We exchanged pleasantries, and I casually mentioned the noise from upstairs. Her expression changed immediately, her smile fading. "There's no one up there," she said, her voice low. "That apartment's been empty for years." I blinked, not sure I'd heard her right. "Empty? Are you sure? I hear noise up there all the time." She nodded, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as if expecting to hear it too. "The last tenant? Well, let's just say no one's lived there since." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. But her words stuck with me, and that night I lay awake listening to the familiar sound of furniture scraping above me. The noise continued off and on for the next few days, and it started to get under my skin. I decided to ask the landlord about it the next time I saw him. He was a friendly guy, always around doing minor repairs or checking in on the renovations. When I finally caught up with him, I mentioned the noise. He paused, his expression unreadable. "There shouldn't be anyone up there," he said slowly. "That apartment's not part of the renovations. It's been locked up for a while." I pushed a little, asking if I could check it out. He hesitated but eventually agreed, handing me a key with a warning. "Just be careful. There's some old furniture and stuff. It hasn't been touched in years." That evening I climbed the stairs to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in places. I found the door to the apartment, a heavy oak thing with a tarnished brass number plate. The key turned with a creak, and I pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, dusty, and cold. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. Just as the landlord had said, there was old furniture scattered around, an antique dresser, a sagging couch, and a dining table with mismatched chairs. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. I walked around, shining the light into each room. It was just an ordinary apartment, though it had a strange, oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of recent activity. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. A large, ornate mirror propped against the wall in the bedroom. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. The frame was carved with strange, twisting patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. I stepped closer, peering into the dusty glass. My reflection stared back, pale and distorted by the grime. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flicker of movement behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the empty room. Nothing. Just shadows dancing on the walls. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was just jumpy. But when I turned back to the mirror, I froze. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't moving like I was. It was staring straight ahead, its eyes wide and unblinking, even as I took a step back. My heart pounded in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the reflection remained fixed, watching me with a cold, blank expression. I backed out of the room, not daring to take my eyes off the mirror until I was out of sight. I locked the apartment door behind me and hurried back downstairs, my mind racing. That night, the noise from above was louder than ever, scraping, thudding, like furniture being dragged across the floor. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under my pillow, but it was relentless. At one point, I thought I heard something else, a faint whispering, like voices murmuring just out of earshot. The next morning, I confronted the landlord again, telling him about the mirror and the noises. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot as I spoke. Finally, he sighed. "There's a reason that apartment's been empty," he said. "The last tenant. She was a young woman, lived there alone. People said she kept to herself, never caused any trouble. But one day she just disappeared. No one saw her leave, and nothing was out of place except that mirror. It wasn't hers. No one knows where it came from." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, disappeared?" He shrugged, his eyes darting to the floor. "Vanished. Police looked into it, but there was nothing. It was like she'd just stepped out of her life." I didn't sleep well after that. The noises continued, and the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was like the apartment above was a living thing, aware of me, waiting. One night, I woke up to a loud crash from upstairs, so loud it shook the ceiling. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing, and ran to the hallway. I stood there staring up at the ceiling, listening to the faint echoes of scraping that slowly faded into silence. That's when I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible, a woman's voice, whispering my name. I packed my bags the next morning and moved out without looking back. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just wanted out. The landlord didn't ask any questions when I handed him the keys. He just nodded, his expression grim as if he'd seen it all before. I found another place across town, a new building with bright lights and plenty of noise from the neighbors, but I still think about that apartment and the woman who disappeared. I wonder if she's still up there, trapped behind the glass of that mirror, watching, waiting for someone else to take her place. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I swear I can still hear it. That faint, rhythmic scraping, like furniture being dragged across the floor above me. I know it's impossible, but every time I get that same cold feeling, like I'm being watched, like the last tenant never really left. I've always been a nature enthusiast ever since I was a kid, hiking through dense forests, camping under a canopy of stars. It was my way of escaping the stress of everyday life. So, when I got the chance to take a solo trip to Blackwood National Park, I jumped at it. Blackwood was one of those places you'd see in travel magazines: endless trees, crystal clear rivers, and trails that stretched for miles. It was perfect, or at least, that's what I thought. I arrived at the park early in the morning, my car packed with everything I'd need for a week of camping and exploring. The park ranger at the visitor center gave me a map and a quick rundown of the trails, warning me to stick to the marked paths. "It's easy to get lost out there," he said, his voice carrying an odd note of concern. "And the weather can change fast." I assured him I'd be careful. I'd done this 100 times before. How different could it be? The first couple of days were uneventful, just the way I liked it. I hiked during the day, taking in the breathtaking views and enjoying the solitude. At night, I set up camp by a small creek, the sound of the running water lulling me to sleep. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I noticed that there wasn't much wildlife, no birds singing in the trees, no squirrels chattering in the underbrush, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was the time of year. By the third day, I decided to venture further into the park, toward a less traveled trail that supposedly led to a secluded lake. The map showed the trail veering off from the main path, winding through dense forest before opening up to the lake. It was marked as difficult, but I was up for the challenge. As I hiked, I noticed the trees grew thicker, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and still, with a faint mist clinging to the ground. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, but every time I stopped and looked around, there was nothing. Just trees, standing tall and silent. The trail was narrow, overgrown with roots and ferns. I kept my eyes on the ground, making sure I didn't trip. After a couple of hours, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. I pulled out my map, trying to get my bearings, but it was no help. I couldn't see any of the landmarks it showed, just an endless stretch of trees in every direction. I kept walking, hoping to find a marker or a familiar sight, but the forest only seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in from all sides. The sense of unease grew stronger, like the forest was somehow alive, watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw it. A figure standing off the trail, half hidden among the trees. It was just a silhouette, unmoving but unmistakably human. My heart leapt and I called out, waving my arm, "Hey, do you know the way to the lake?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't even react. I took a step closer, squinting through the dim light. But as I got closer, it seemed to fade, dissolving into the shadows. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure was gone. I stood there, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. I turned back the way I came, trying to retrace my steps, but the trail seemed different, unfamiliar. The trees all looked the same, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes like skeletal fingers reaching out to snare me. I walked faster, my breathing growing ragged. The forest was too quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves underfoot. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. Just silence, thick and oppressive. I don't know how long I wandered, but eventually I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was an old, decrepit cabin, its wood dark and rotting, partially swallowed by the encroaching forest. There was no path leading to it, no signs that anyone had been there in years. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I was exhausted and needed to regroup. I approached the cabin, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I stepped onto the porch. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, peering inside. The interior was sparse. A single room with a dirt floor, an old table, and a couple of rusted chairs. A strange, sweet smell lingered in the air, like rotting fruit. On the table lay a journal, its pages yellowed and frayed. I picked it up, flipping through the entries. Most were illegible, the ink smeared and faded, but one page caught my eye. The writing was shaky, frantic, like it had been scribbled in a hurry. The forest is wrong. The trees, they move. I hear them whispering, calling my name. It's been days, maybe weeks. I can't find the way out. The lake. It's not real. I saw someone today. I thought it was help, but it wasn't. It's watching me, waiting. I'm not alone here. If you find this, get out. Don't follow the voices. I dropped the journal, my hands trembling. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, pressing in around me. I stepped outside, scanning the forest, but everything looked the same. The trees loomed, their branches twisted into eerie shapes like frozen figures caught in the act of reaching. I decided to keep moving, determined to find my way back. I checked my watch, but the screen was black. The battery, which had been nearly full that morning, was dead. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back in my pack, my sense of time slipping away. The forest felt endless, a maze of identical trees and winding paths that led nowhere. I saw the figure again, several times, always just at the edge of my vision, disappearing when I tried to focus on it. Each time it seemed closer, like it was guiding me deeper into the woods. I don't know when I realized I was going in circles, but the panic hit hard when I found myself back at the cabin. It was like the forest was playing tricks, warping and shifting around me. I tried marking trees with my knife, but every time I thought I'd made progress, I'd find the marks in a completely different direction, or not at all. I was lost, truly lost, and the forest knew it. As night fell, the mist thickened, swirling around my feet like ghostly fingers. The temperature dropped and a creeping cold settled into my bones. I stumbled, exhausted, my legs aching. My flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the darkness in weak, erratic pulses. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic chanting barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. It was like a distant hum, a low murmur that seemed to come from all around me. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound was too faint to make out. I took a step forward, then another, following the noise. It grew louder, though I still couldn't discern the words. It was like a lullaby, soothing and strange, pulling me deeper into the forest. I knew I should turn back, that I should try to find a way out, but the sound was irresistible, drawing me in. I reached another clearing, this one larger than before. In the center stood a massive tree, its gnarled roots twisting into the ground like claws. The chanting was louder here, though there was no one around. I approached the tree, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw them. Carved into the bark, dozens of names, each one scratched deeply into the wood. At the bottom of the tree, freshly etched, was my name. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The chanting grew louder, swirling around me like a chorus of disembodied voices. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching down, their whispers growing urgent and frantic. I ran. I don't remember how long or how far, but I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. The chanting faded, replaced by the deafening silence of the forest. I lay there gasping, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't care. I just needed to get away. When I finally got up, the forest seemed different. The trees were less dense, the light filtering through the branches. I kept walking, not sure where I was going, just moving. And then suddenly I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main trail. I never looked back. I made it to the park's visitor center just as the sun was rising, disheveled and wild-eyed. The ranger from my first day was there, and he looked at me with a mix of concern and relief. "You're lucky," he said. "Not everyone comes back." I packed up my car and left Blackwood National Park that morning, vowing never to return. I still don't know what I encountered in those woods, or what the forest was hiding, but I can't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that it let me go. And sometimes late at night I hear that faint rhythmic chanting in my dreams, calling me back to the silent forest. And I know if I ever go back I might not make it out again. I've been a truck driver for over a decade, crisscrossing the country with nothing but miles of highway, and the occasional diner to break the monotony. Most of the time it's peaceful, just me, the road, and the steady hum of the engine. But there's one night I'll never forget, one night that changed everything. It was a chilly November evening when I picked up a load of crates from a small warehouse on the outskirts of a sleepy town. The route was a straight shot through the mountains, a few hundred miles of winding roads and dark stretches. I knew the route well, but this time something felt off. The dispatcher had warned me about a storm moving in, but the weather looked clear enough when I set out. I figured I'd make good time before the storm hit. I settled into the driver's seat, put on a podcast, and began my drive. The road was empty, the only company my truck's headlights slicing through the darkness. As I drove deeper into the mountains, the landscape became increasingly isolated. The road twisted and turned, hugging the edges of steep cliffs. The only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. Around midnight, as I was rounding a particularly sharp bend, my headlights caught something unusual. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just inches from him. I leaned out of the window, trying to get a better look. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" I called. The man didn't move, didn't even react. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead. I could see now that his eyes were hollow, like there was nothing behind them. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't about to get out of the truck. Instead, I waited a few moments, hoping he'd move on. When he didn't, I honked the horn, a long, blaring sound that should have startled anyone. Still, he stood there, unmoving. Finally, I revved the engine, nudging the truck forward just enough to make him step aside. He did, slowly, as if it took a great effort. As I drove past him, I glanced in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. A long, dark trail on the road, like something had been dragged through the dirt. I didn't want to think about it. I shook my head and focused on the road. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew. The road ahead was empty, too empty, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. I couldn't shake the image of that man's empty eyes from my mind. The storm hit faster than expected. Rain poured down in sheets, making it difficult to see even a few feet in front of me. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the road became a slick, treacherous mess. I had to slow down to a crawl, my focus entirely on the road. Around 2 a.m., the radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was distorted, like the signal was breaking up. "This is dispatch. We've received reports of road closures up ahead due to the storm. Stay alert, over." I acknowledged the message and kept going. That's when I saw it again. A figure in the middle of the road. My heart raced as I slammed on the brakes, skidding through the rain. The figure was the same man I'd seen earlier, but this time he was different. His clothes were even more tattered and his face was even more gaunt. He was holding something in his hands, but the darkness made it impossible to see what it was. I couldn't risk hitting him, so I waited, my headlights illuminating the ghostly figure. When he finally stepped aside, I saw the trail behind him again. Longer this time, more distinct. It looked like a trail of blood. I drove past him, the chill in the air making it hard to breathe. The road seemed endless, every turn revealing nothing but darkness. I felt like I was driving through a tunnel with no way out. Then, as I turned another sharp bend, I saw it, a large, dilapidated house sitting alone by the road, its windows dark and broken. The figure was standing in front of it, motionless, watching me as I approached. My instinct was to keep driving, but the rain was so heavy now that I had no choice but to pull over. I could barely see through the windshield, but the outline of the house was unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, my boots splashing through the puddles. As I approached the house, the door creaked open. The inside was dark, except for a flickering light coming from what looked like a single candle. I hesitated, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong drove me forward. I called out a, "Hello, is anyone here?" The only response was the sound of my own voice echoing off the walls. I stepped inside, the air cold and damp. The candlelight cast eerie shadows across the room, revealing old furniture covered in cobwebs and dust. I noticed something on the floor, a series of strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood. They were arranged in a pattern surrounding a central point. My flashlight revealed something in the center, an old weathered journal. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was written in a shaky, almost frantic script. It spoke of rituals, of summoning, and of a never-ending torment. The last entry was dated only a few days before, and it was written in a desperate hand. "The road claims its own. We are bound to this place, forever lost in its grip. If you find this, know that you are next. Beware the one who walks the road. He will lead you to the house, where you will join us." My blood ran cold. I turned to leave, but the air grew thick, suffocating. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I heard a low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and the eerie flicker of the candlelight. I bolted out of the house, my heart pounding. The rain had let up slightly, and the road looked clearer. I raced back to the truck, not daring to look back. The figure was gone, and the trail of blood had vanished. I drove the rest of the way through the night, never slowing down. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I reported the strange occurrences to the local authorities. They looked at me like I was crazy, and no one seemed to know anything about the house or the figure I'd seen. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that road. I never saw the man again, and the house was never found on any map. The only thing I know for sure is that sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I can still feel that cold, oppressive air and hear that low growl echoing in the back of my mind. And every time I drive through those mountains, I can't help but wonder if the road is still watching, waiting for its next victim. The first time I heard the whisper was on a particularly stormy night. The rain was lashing against my window, and the wind howled with a ferocity that set my nerves on edge. I was alone in the old manor I had inherited from my great-aunt, a sprawling relic of a house filled with creaky floorboards and dusty memories. I had decided to spend the night in the library, a grand room lined with towering shelves filled with books long forgotten by time. A crackling fire in the hearth was my only companion, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. It was then, as I was drifting between the lines of an ancient tome, that I first heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, a trick of nature playing on my imagination. But as I strained to listen, the whisper became clearer, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, where an ornate, full-length mirror stood. The mirror had always unnerved me. Its frame was engraved with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight. With a mix of curiosity and dread, I approached the mirror. The whisper grew louder, forming words that chilled me to the bone. "Help me," it pleaded, a voice barely above a breath, yet filled with a desperation that made my skin crawl. Instinctively, I reached out to touch the glass, and a jolt of electricity surged through my fingers. I recoiled, heart pounding, as a figure materialized in the reflection. A young woman, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Her lips moved, forming the same desperate plea. "Help me." I stumbled back, my mind racing. Who was she? How was this possible? My logical mind wrestled with the impossibility of it all, but the fear was real, tangible. The woman in the mirror seemed trapped, her eyes imploring me to do something, anything. I spent the next few days trying to uncover the history of the manor and the mirror. I scoured old family records and dusty journals, piecing together fragments of the past. The mirror, it seemed, was a relic from a bygone era, rumored to be cursed, a portal to the other side. Night after night, the whispers continued, growing more urgent, more frantic. The woman's presence haunted me, her eyes following me even when I turned away. I knew I had to help her, but how? Driven by desperation, I decided to confront the mirror. I lit candles around the room, their flickering flames casting an eerie glow. With a deep breath, I stood before the mirror, determined to free the spirit trapped within. "Tell me how to help you," I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman's reflection flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. But then, her expression twisted into one of malevolence. Her lips curved into a sinister smile, and the whisper transformed into a chilling laugh that echoed through the room. Suddenly the candles extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and a voice, no longer a whisper, but a growl, reverberated around me. "Now you're mine." I stumbled back, heart racing, as the mirror's surface rippled like water. The woman's reflection reached out, her hand breaching the glass and pulling me in with a force I couldn't resist. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips as I was engulfed by the darkness. The next moment I found myself standing in a dimly lit room, identical to the library, yet different. Everything was reversed, a mirror image of the world I knew. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. I was now the one trapped, the one in the mirror, and the woman, now free, stood on the other side, smiling at me. In a voice that echoed with both triumph and pity, she whispered, "Thank you." The realization hit me like a cold wave. I had been deceived. The woman wasn't a trapped spirit seeking help. She was a clever, malevolent entity seeking a way out. And I had taken her place. Now every night I whisper to those who wander into the library, hoping, praying that someone will make the same mistake I did. But in my heart, I know the truth. The mirror has claimed me, and there is no escape. And so I wait, a prisoner of my own folly, forever trapped in the mirror's whisper. I've always hated the flickering light in my hallway. It's one of those small annoyances you keep meaning to fix but never do, like the loose tile in the bathroom or the creaky step on the staircase. Every time I walked past it, it would buzz and flicker as if taunting me. But in the grand scheme of life's problems, a twitchy bulb was low on the priority list. Until that night. It started like any other evening. I was home alone, trying to wind down after a long day at work. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional honk of a car from the street below. I was scrolling through my phone, mindlessly watching videos when the power dipped for a split second, plunging the apartment into darkness. I let out a groan. Typical city infrastructure. The lights flickered back on a moment later, but I noticed that the hallway light was still acting up, flickering in a rapid, jittery rhythm. I sighed, making a mental note to replace it the next day, and went back to my phone. But then it flickered off completely, and the hallway was swallowed in shadow. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the hall. I paused, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound was soft but distinct. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming closer, a slow, deliberate pace that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I stood up, my heart thudding in my chest. It was probably just a loose pipe or something, I told myself. But deep down, I felt something else, an instinctual, primal fear that I couldn't shake. I peeked into the hallway, and that's when I saw her. A shadowy figure stood at the end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the dim light. It was a woman, her head bowed, hair matted and hanging in tangled clumps over her face. Her dress was tattered, and she seemed to sway slightly, as if caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I opened them, she was still there, unmoving, watching. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind raced, scrambling for some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The hallway light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls, and that's when she lifted her head. Her eyes were empty. Not just dark or hollow, but completely devoid of anything. Two gaping voids that seemed to swallow the light. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the tapping grew louder, echoing in the confined space of the hall. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled back, my hand slamming against the light switch. The bulb buzzed angrily, flickering faster now, and in that strobe-like glow, she began to move, her limbs jerking in unnatural, disjointed motions as she lurched forward. I turned and bolted into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the lock. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering as I listened. The tapping had stopped, but I could hear her breathing, ragged, labored breaths that seemed to fill the room with an icy dread. Suddenly, the lights in my room flickered and went out. I fumbled in the dark, my fingers brushing against my phone. I grabbed it, using the screen's glow to illuminate the room. My mind was screaming at me to call someone, anyone, but my fingers were numb, refusing to cooperate. Then the scratching started, soft at first, like nails on a chalkboard coming from the other side of the door. I could hear her muttering now, incoherent whispers that slithered through the darkness and coiled around my mind. I clutched my phone tighter, the glow casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I tried to make a call, but the screen glitched, lines of static running across it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I felt like I was suffocating, the air thick with dread. The scratching intensified and the door began to shake, rattling on its hinges. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted to the window, yanking it open with trembling hands. I looked down. The fire escape was just a few feet away. I was ready to jump when the lights flickered back on and the noises stopped abruptly. I turned back to the door. Silence. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, fatigue, maybe a bad dream. But then my eyes fell on the floor, and my blood ran cold. There were scratches all over the wooden door, deep gouges like something had tried to claw its way in. And in the middle of the room, where the light barely reached, stood the woman, her empty eyes locked onto mine. I screamed and leapt out of the window, tumbling onto the fire escape. I didn't look back as I scrambled down the rickety stairs, each step a desperate bid to get away from that apartment. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. I called a friend and crashed at their place that night. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord and demanded to be let out of my lease. I didn't care about the deposit. I just needed to get out of that building. I never went back, not even to collect my things. Months passed and I tried to put it behind me, convincing myself it was a hallucination, some kind of stress-induced nightmare. But the other day, I got a call from my old landlord. He was irate, talking about damages and accusing me of trashing the place before I left. I denied everything, but then he sent me a picture of the apartment. My blood turned to ice. There, scrawled across the hallway wall, were words I never wrote, "Why did you leave me?" And beneath it, in smeared red letters that looked disturbingly like blood, was a single phrase, "You're next. The flickering light is still there." I've never been one for antiques. Old things always felt too steeped in history, too haunted by lives lived long ago. But when I moved into my new apartment, it was bare. Plain white walls, cheap furniture, the kind of place that felt more like a temporary stop than a home. So when I stumbled across an ornate, full-length mirror at a flea market, I thought, why not? It was cheap, elegant, and would fill the empty space in my bedroom. The vendor didn't say much, just smiled a crooked smile and accepted my cash without a word. That should have been my first clue. I set the mirror up in my bedroom, leaning it against the wall opposite my bed. It was beautiful, with an old wooden frame carved into intricate designs of vines and flowers. The glass was slightly cloudy, giving everything it reflected a soft, dreamlike haze. It made my cramped room look bigger, more sophisticated, and for a while I didn't think much more about it. But then things started to get strange. It was little things at first. I'd glance at the mirror and see my reflection linger a second too long after I'd moved. Or I'd catch a glimpse of something, just a flicker, in the background that vanished the moment I tried to focus on it. I chalked it up to my imagination, the kind of tricks your mind plays on you when you're tired and stressed. But one night, Everything changed. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone with the lights dimmed, when I noticed the reflection in the mirror. My reflection was just sitting there, staring back at me, which was normal enough. But as I looked closer, I realized something was off. My reflection's eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too intense, as if it were watching me with a strange kind of hunger. I blinked, and the reflection blinked back, its movements too synchronized, too deliberate. I laughed it off nervously, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I got up to turn off the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection's eyes were following me, tracking my every move. That night, I had the most vivid nightmares. I was standing in front of the mirror, but my reflection was different. It was smiling, a cruel, twisted grin that I would never make. I tried to turn away, but my reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning wider and wider, until its mouth stretched too far, splitting at the corners. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The mirror was just a shadow in the dark, but I swore I could see that grin, lingering in the glass. The next day, I covered the mirror with a sheet. I told myself it was just a bad dream, just a coincidence. But every time I walked past it, I could feel something watching me, something pressing against the thin barrier of the sheet, eager to get out. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint rustling sound. It was subtle, like the sound of fabric being dragged across the floor. I turned on the light, my heart pounding, and saw that the sheet had fallen off the mirror. It lay crumpled on the floor, as if something had pushed it away from the inside. I approached the mirror cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. But I had to know. I had to see if it was just my imagination. I peeled the sheet back up and looked into the glass. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection was just me. But then, it tilted its head to the side, the way a curious dog might, and I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't moved. I was standing perfectly still, but my reflection was tilting its head in that slow, deliberate way, watching me with those same wide, unblinking eyes. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The reflection straightened its head, but now there was a slight smile playing on its lips. It was a small, subtle smirk, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I grabbed the sheet and threw it back over the mirror, backing out of the room, never taking my eyes off that covered frame. I slept on the couch that night, too afraid to stay in the same room as the mirror. The next morning I decided it had to go. I didn't care how much I liked it before. Something about it was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. But when I tried to move the mirror, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it were bolted to the floor, though I knew it was just leaning against the wall. I pulled and tugged, but it wouldn't move an inch. Frustrated and scared, I threw the sheet back over it and left the apartment, spending the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was just losing my mind. When I returned home that evening, the sheet was off again. It was neatly folded at the foot of the mirror, as if placed there deliberately. My reflection was waiting for me, that unsettling smile wider now, showing too many teeth. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and marched into the bedroom, determined to smash the damn thing to pieces. But as I raised the hammer, my reflection moved on its own again, raising its hand as if to shield itself. And then it spoke. "Please don't." The voice was mine, but distorted, like hearing yourself on a warped tape. I froze, my arm trembling as I stared into those desperate, pleading eyes. The reflection pressed its hand against the glass, and for a moment I thought I felt a faint, cold pressure against my own. "I want out," it said, its voice cracking with a desperation that sent chills down my spine. "I've been trapped for so long." I dropped the hammer, stumbling back. My reflection didn't move, just stood there, hand against the glass, staring at me with a look of despair. It wasn't smiling anymore. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I could still hear it calling to me, muffled through the walls, begging to be let out. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the closed bedroom door, listening to the soft, pleading whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks. By morning, I was done. I called a friend, explained the bare minimum, and we took the mirror to the dumpster. I couldn't stand to look at it, couldn't bear the thought of seeing those eyes one more time. We dumped it, and as it hit the ground, I heard the glass shatter. Relief washed over me. A heavy weight lifted from my chest. I went home, exhausted but feeling safer than I had in days. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a familiar chill. I turned on the light and nearly screamed. There, on my wall where the mirror used to be, was a long, jagged crack running from floor to ceiling, like something had tried to claw its way out. And from the darkness of my closet, I heard a faint, distorted whisper. "Thank you for letting me in." It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. I had been swamped with work, stressed to the point of breaking, and I needed a break. A friend had recommended Pine Hollow National Park, a lesser-known spot, far from the crowded tourist traps. The perfect place to unplug, he said, with trails that meandered through dense forests and around crystal-clear lakes. It sounded ideal. I arrived late in the afternoon, eager to disconnect from the world for a while. There was something serene about the towering pines and the cool, fresh air that filled my lungs. I set up my tent at a secluded campsite near the edge of the forest, feeling more at ease than I had in weeks. But as dusk settled over the park, a strange sense of unease crept in. The forest, which had seemed so inviting in the light of day, now felt dense and impenetrable. The trees swayed gently, their tops brushing against the darkening sky, and I could have sworn I heard whispers on the wind, soft, unintelligible murmurs that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but a part of me felt like the forest was watching, waiting. As night fell, I built a small fire and tried to relax. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp around the campsite. I stared into the fire, losing track of time, when suddenly I heard it. A faint rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming on wood. I looked around, but there was no one there, just the trees, standing silently in the darkness. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, echoing through the still night. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the woods, half expecting to see a raccoon or some other small animal. But the beam cut through the trees, revealing only empty spaces and twisted branches. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I chuckled nervously, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I crawled into my tent, zipping it tightly, and settled into my sleeping bag. I was drifting off when I heard it again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now, and it was coming from just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was so close I could feel the vibrations, like something tapping against the fabric of the tent itself. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just the tapping, relentless and rhythmic. I unzipped the tent slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and peered out. The forest was still, bathed in the dim light of the moon. I swung the flashlight around, the beam flickering as I swept it across the trees. Nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and crawled back inside, my nerves on edge. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting just beyond the reach of the light, moving between the trees with an unnatural, jerky motion. I froze, every muscle tensed, watching as the shadow flitted from tree to tree, too fast, too fluid. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no logical explanation. The tapping started again, louder and more erratic, as if whatever was out there was becoming impatient. I backed up into the tent, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The shadow moved closer, and for the first time I caught a glimpse of it, a tall, thin figure, barely more than a silhouette. Its limbs were too long, its movements too sharp, like it was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I bolted from the tent, running blindly into the woods. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I stumbled through the underbrush, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. The tapping followed me, echoing in the dark, relentless and inescapable. I finally stopped when I reached a clearing, gasping for breath. The moon cast an eerie glow over the open space, illuminating a circle of ancient, towering pines. I turned in a frantic circle, scanning the tree line, but there was no sign of the figure. Just silence, oppressive and heavy. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, like leaves rustling in the wind. But as I listened, I realized it was voices, overlapping and intertwining, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They were coming from the trees, their branches swaying as if stirred by an invisible hand. I shone my flashlight into the canopy, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating the thick foliage. And then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them, carved into the bark of the trees, twisted and contorted in expressions of agony and fear. They stared down at me, their eyes hollow and unseeing, mouths open in silent screams. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they were coming from the faces, as if the trees themselves were trying to speak. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the forest floor. The ground beneath me felt strange, soft and spongy, and when I shone the light down, I saw why. The earth was littered with bones, small, delicate bones that crunched under my weight. Animal bones, I told myself, but deep down, I knew better. I scrambled to my feet, but the faces were everywhere, watching me with those empty eyes. The whispers were a cacophony now, overlapping in a maddening chorus that made my head throb. I backed away, desperate to escape, but every direction I turned there were more faces, more whispers. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned slowly, knowing what I would see. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its outline sharp against the moonlight. It was closer now, its limbs twitching unnaturally as it took a step forward. Its head tilted to the side, and I realized with a surge of terror that it was studying me, just as I had studied the faces in the trees. The figure raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at me. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my head like needles being driven into my skull. I dropped the flashlight, clutching my head, and fell to my knees. Everything went black. When I woke up, it was daylight. I was lying in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by the ancient pines. The whispers were gone, the faces just knots in the bark. I scrambled to my feet, every muscle aching, and staggered back toward the campsite. My tent was still there, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. I packed up in a frenzy, throwing everything into my bag with shaking hands. I didn't look back as I made my way to the car, my mind racing with what I had seen. The ranger at the entrance looked at me curiously as I sped past, but I didn't stop to explain. What could I say? That the forest was alive, that the trees were watching, that there was something in Pine Hollow that didn't want me there. I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all some kind of vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, just at the edge of hearing, but they're there. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel eyes on me, like the pines have followed me home. The last thing I saw before I left the park was a sign at the entrance, half hidden by overgrown bushes. It read, "Beware of the whispering pines. Stay on the marked trails." I don't think I'll ever go back, but some nights when the wind blows just right, I can hear the tapping, and I know it's still out there, waiting for the next person to stray too far from the path. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot on the road. You learn to keep your wits about you, especially when you're driving long hauls through the dead of night. You see things, strange things, that you can't always explain. But there's one night, one delivery, that still haunts me to this day. It was a typical late-night run hauling a load through the back roads of New Mexico. My dispatcher had given me a route that cut through the desert, avoiding the interstates. It was supposed to save time, but it was the kind of road that didn't see much traffic, just endless stretches of cracked asphalt, framed by vast empty desert on either side. The radio wasn't picking up any stations, so it was just me, the hum of the engine, and the occasional rattle of the cab. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to make out the jagged silhouettes of distant mountains. It was past midnight, and the road was so dark that my headlights seemed to be swallowed by the night. I was cruising along, trying to keep my eyes from getting too heavy, when I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, another trick of the shadows. But as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt as I brought the rig to a stop just a few feet away from the figure. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins. I leaned out the window, squinting into the darkness. "Hey, you all right?" I called out. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in old, worn-out clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame. His head was bowed, and he stood unnaturally still, as if frozen in place. I couldn't see his face, just the top of his head and the long, tangled hair that hung down over his eyes. I thought maybe he was hurt, or worse, drunk and lost in the desert. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, keeping the truck's lights trained on him. The desert air was cool, and the silence was thick, broken only by the idling engine. "Hey, buddy, you need help?" I said, walking closer. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. The man still hadn't moved, not even a twitch. He was just standing there, staring at the ground. I was about 10 feet away when he finally looked up. His eyes were wrong, completely black, like twin voids that seemed to swallow the light. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there was something off about the way he held himself, like a puppet hanging from invisible strings. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a faint wheeze that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I backed up, my gut telling me something was terribly wrong. The man took a step forward, and that's when I noticed his feet. They weren't touching the ground. He was hovering an inch above the asphalt, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed to the cab. I slammed the door shut and threw the truck into reverse, my heart racing. The figure didn't chase me, just stood there, watching as I backed up, those black eyes fixed on me like he was staring straight through the windshield. I spun the wheel and peeled off down the road, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The man was still there, growing smaller as I sped away, until the darkness swallowed him completely. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the road, but my mind was spinning. Who or what had I just seen? I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see him reappear, but the road behind me was empty, just blacktop and desert. I drove for miles, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, replaced by an uneasy calm. I kept telling myself it was just a hitchhiker, someone playing a sick joke, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. I've seen a lot on the road, but nothing like that. About an hour later, I spotted a diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. The parking lot was empty, save for a couple of dusty cars and an old RV. I pulled in, desperate for a break and maybe some answers. Inside, the diner was dimly lit, with faded booths and a lone waitress who looked like she hadn't slept in days. I slid into a booth near the window, keeping an eye on the truck through the glass. The waitress came over, her tired eyes barely glancing up from her notepad. "What can I get you?" she asked in a monotone voice. "Just coffee," I said, rubbing my temples. "And, have you seen anyone weird around here? Like a guy out on the road, maybe looking lost?" She paused, her pen hovering over the notepad. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, not sure how to explain. There was this guy standing in the middle of the road. Looked off. Black eyes, kind of floating. I don't know. It was probably nothing. The waitress's expression didn't change, but she glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "You were on Route 84, weren't you?" I nodded. "Yeah, how'd you know?" She sighed, setting the notepad down and leaning in close. You're not the first. People see things on that stretch of road. They say it's cursed. Folks have been disappearing out there for decades. Drivers, hikers, even locals. They see things. Black eyes, like you said. Shadows. It's not a place to be after dark. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What happens to them? She shook her head. Most never make it back. Those who do, well, they're never the same. If I were you, I'd stick to the main roads from now on. I nodded, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the coffee she poured. The warmth of the cup didn't chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I finished the coffee quickly, paid, and headed back to the truck, her words echoing in my mind. I was about to climb back into the cab when I noticed something off. The truck was fine, same as I'd left it. But there, in the dust on the windshield, were smudged handprints. Long, thin prints that trailed across the glass like someone or something had been trying to peer inside. I wiped them away with a rag, my pulse quickening. I fired up the engine and got back on the road, sticking to the routes I knew, the well-lit highways where I could see for miles. I didn't stop until I was hours away from that diner, from Route 84, from whatever had been out there in the dark. I don't take back roads anymore. I stick to the crowded routes, the ones where I can see the lights of other trucks and the familiar signs of civilization. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirrors, a shadow that flickers just at the edge of my vision, or a figure standing on the side of the road that vanishes when I look again. And every time, I can't help but wonder if it's the man with the black eyes, still searching for his next ride, still waiting for someone to wander too far off the beaten path, still haunting the lonely stretches of Route 84. I keep my eyes on the road now, but I know better than to look too closely, because out there in the darkness, some things are better left unseen. Camping has always been my escape. There's something about disconnecting from the world and immersing yourself in nature that feels like hitting the reset button on life. I've camped in forests, by lakes, and even in the mountains, and it's always been a peaceful experience. But that all changed after one weekend in Black Hollow Forest, a place I'll never set foot in again. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me, a tent, and the tranquility of the woods. I'd heard about Black Hollow from a coworker who said it was a hidden gem, far from the usual crowded campsites and tourist traps, perfect for someone looking to get away from it all. I packed my gear, loaded up the car, and drove out there one Friday afternoon, eager to unwind. The forest was beautiful, dense with towering pines that swayed gently in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. I found a clearing near a small stream, the sound of running water adding to the serene atmosphere. I pitched my tent, set up a small fire pit, and settled in for what I expected to be a relaxing weekend. But as dusk began to fall, a strange feeling washed over me. It was subtle at first, just an odd sense that I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, blaming it on the isolation and the fact that I was far from any other campers. I'd done solo trips before, and it was normal to feel a little uneasy in unfamiliar woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As night settled in, the forest grew eerily quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and night birds were absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. I sat by the fire, poking at the flames with a stick, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had begun to gnaw at my nerves. The shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance and twist in ways that didn't match the flickering flames, and every rustle of leaves had me glancing over my shoulder. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from deeper in the woods. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the trees, unnaturally loud in the silence. I stood up, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the thick underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. No response, just the tapping, persistent and deliberate. I took a few steps toward the noise, my flashlight sweeping across the trees. The tapping stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. Then, just as I was about to turn back, the tapping resumed, this time closer, as if whatever was making it had moved silently through the woods. While I stood there, I backed away, my nerves on edge, and returned to the fire, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't like it, but there was no way I was going to investigate further in the dark. I tossed another log on the fire, trying to focus on the warmth and the light, but the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me, as if drawn by the flickering flames. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly, and lay there with my flashlight clutched in my hand. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or some other creature making the noise. But as I lay there, I heard it again, tap, 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 coming from all around the campsite now, as if the forest itself was alive and surrounding me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the tapping, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig that sounded far too close for comfort. I lay there, listening, every nerve on edge, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent cautiously, blinking in the harsh morning light. The forest looked normal, quiet, peaceful, as if the events of the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. I shook my head, feeling foolish, and decided to pack up and leave. As much as I loved camping, I had no desire to spend another night in those woods. But as I was packing up my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft earth around my campsite, dozens of them, all circling my tent. They were small, too small to be an adult's, and barefoot. The prints were perfectly formed, as if made by a group of children who had been tiptoeing around the tent all night. I followed the trail with my eyes, and my heart sank when I saw they led into the woods, toward the direction of the tapping. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was a group of kids playing a prank, I told myself. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it didn't make sense. I hadn't seen any other campers, no signs of life, not even distant campfires in the night. And why would children be wandering the forest barefoot in the middle of the night? I finished packing up as quickly as I could, every hair on my body standing on end. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching from the shadows. The forest was too quiet, too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I practically threw my gear into the car, eager to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. Standing at the edge of the clearing were figures, pale and motionless, watching me leave. They were too far away to make out clearly, but I could see their faces were blank, expressionless, and their eyes were black pits that seemed to drink in the light. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I sped out of there, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't look back again until I was miles away, and by then the figures were long gone, swallowed by the forest. I reported it to the rangers when I got to the nearest town, but they just looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern. "Probably just some local kids messing around," one of them said, though his expression told me he didn't quite believe it either. I've tried to rationalize it ever since. Maybe it was a prank, maybe it was just my imagination, but I can't forget those footprints, or the way the tapping seemed to follow me through the woods. I can't forget those figures standing in the trees watching with those empty eyes. I haven't been camping since. The woods, which once felt like a sanctuary, now feel like something else entirely, something ancient, something that watches from the shadows, waiting for the next camper to stray too far into its depths. And every now and then, in the dead of night, I still hear the tapping, soft, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. It's as if the forest is calling, reminding me that it's still out there, waiting. And I know that no matter how far I run, I'll never truly escape the watchers in the woods. I work for a small-town newspaper, the kind that covers local high school football games, town hall meetings, and the occasional feel-good story about someone's dog rescuing a cat from a tree. It's a quiet job in a quiet town, and most days it's just routine. But every now and then something comes up that reminds me why I became a journalist in the first place. Last year, that something was the disappearances. It started with just one, a young woman named Katie, who was last seen leaving a local bar late one night. She was a regular there, and the bartender remembered her leaving alone. She never made it home. Her car was found abandoned on a side road, doors locked, keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle, no leads, nothing. People go missing all the time, even in small towns. But then it happened again, and again. A few weeks after Katie vanished, a middle-aged man named Tom was reported missing by his wife. He'd gone out for a walk, something he did every evening, but this time he didn't come back. The search parties found nothing, not even a footprint. He'd simply vanished. And then there was Mrs. Calloway, the elderly widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town. She was last seen watering her garden in the morning. By afternoon, she was gone. Her house was left untouched, dinner set on the table as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. The town was on edge. We'd never had anything like this happen before. 3 people, gone without a trace, all within the span of a month. The police were stumped. No connections between the victims, no evidence, no clues, just a string of vanishings that left everyone feeling uneasy. As a journalist, it was my job to cover the story, but it quickly became personal. I knew these people. I'd seen Katie at the coffee shop, nodded at Tom on his evening walks, waved to Mrs. Calloway from my car. They were my neighbors and they were gone. I couldn't let it go. I started digging, combing through old records and news clippings, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I found something that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the first time. 30 years ago, our town had experienced a similar wave of disappearances. 4 people had gone missing in the span of 2 months. Like now, there were no connections between them, no evidence, no trace of where they went. The cases were never solved, and eventually they were forgotten. Just another unsolved mystery in the dusty archives of small-town history. I brought this up to the police, but they were dismissive. Coincidence, they said. People go missing all the time. But it didn't feel like a coincidence to me. It felt like a pattern, like something was happening to our town, and it was happening again. One night I was at my desk, staring at the maps I'd pinned up on the wall, trying to find a link between the locations where the victims were last seen. It was late, the newsroom was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. I was about to pack up when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I know what happened to them. Meet me at the old train station at midnight. Come alone. My first thought was that it was a prank. The old train station had been abandoned for years, a crumbling relic on the edge of town, long forgotten and overgrown with weeds. But something about the message felt urgent, real. I decided to go. I didn't tell anyone, partly because I didn't want to sound like a fool chasing after some anonymous tip, but mostly because a part of me needed to know the truth. I arrived at the station just before midnight. It was a cold, clear night, the moon high and bright, casting long shadows across the decaying platform. The place was as abandoned as I remembered, windows shattered, the roof sagging with age. I waited, my breath fogging in the cool air, listening to the wind whistle through the broken glass. After a few minutes, I started to think it really was just a prank, but then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound like footsteps on gravel. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the noise. Standing at the far end of the platform was a man, his back to me, staring down the tracks. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard me. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The man still didn't turn. As I got closer, I could see his hair was gray, disheveled, and his shoulders were slumped. Something about him felt off, like he didn't quite belong there. I was about 10 feet away when I noticed the smell, an acrid metallic scent that made my stomach turn. "Hey!" I called out again, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "Did you text me?" The man slowly turned his head, and I froze. His face was gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. But what struck me most was his expression, a mix of sorrow and fear that seemed to radiate from him like a tangible force. "They're still here," he said, his voice a rasp that barely carried over the wind. "They never left." Before I could ask what he meant, he pointed down the tracks. I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. For a moment I saw nothing, just the tracks stretching into the distance, half buried under years of neglect. But then, in the faint light of the moon, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them standing along the tracks, barely visible in the gloom. They were motionless, like shadowy silhouettes cut out of the night, all facing the same direction. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I recognized some of them. Katie, with her long hair hanging limp over her shoulders. Tom, still in his walking clothes. Mrs. Calloway, her face twisted in a look of quiet despair. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. They just stood there staring down the tracks, as if waiting for something that would never come. "They're lost," the man said, his voice breaking. "They're all lost, trapped here. They can't move on." I turned to ask him what he meant, but he was gone. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was no sign of him. Just the empty platform and the silent figures on the tracks. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I drove home, my mind reeling with what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, staring blankly into the dark. The next morning I went to the police, but they didn't believe me. "You were tired, stressed," they said. "You imagined it." But I knew what I'd seen. I knew those people were still out there, trapped in some kind of purgatory, waiting for something they couldn't name. The disappearances stopped after that night, but the town never felt the same. I kept writing, kept digging, but I never found any answers, just more questions, and the nagging feeling that whatever had happened wasn't over. Every now and then I drive by the old train station. It's still abandoned, still crumbling, but I can't bring myself to go back inside. I can't look down those tracks again, can't see those figures standing there, waiting. And sometimes late at night when the town is quiet and the wind is still, I think I hear it. The faint distant sound of footsteps on gravel, like the echoes of those who vanished, still wandering, still lost, still waiting for a way back home. I travel a lot for work, and I've stayed in more hotels than I can count. Most of them blur together, generic rooms with stiff sheets, a view of the parking lot, and that faint, musty smell that never quite goes away. But there's one hotel I'll never forget. One night that still haunts me, no matter how many places I've stayed since. It was a business trip to a small city I'd never been to before. My flight was delayed, and by the time I got to the hotel, it was past midnight. The place was old, with a faded Art Deco facade and flickering neon sign. Not exactly 5-star, but it was close to the office, and I was too tired to care. I checked in at the front desk. The clerk was a young woman who barely looked up from her computer as she handed me my keycard. "Room 917, she said, her voice flat and mechanical. "Elevators to your left." I nodded, thanked her, and dragged my suitcase toward the elevator. The lobby was dimly lit, the kind of place where the bulbs never seem bright enough, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The elevator was old, with one of those metal gates you have to pull shut before the doors will close. It creaked and groaned as it ascended, the floor numbers ticking by slowly, almost reluctantly. When I stepped out on the 9th floor, the hallway was silent. Too silent. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The carpet was a deep red, worn thin in places, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that might have been stylish 50 years ago. A faint odor of mildew hung in the air. I found room 917 at the far end of the hall. The door was like any other, but as I slid the key card in, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, and pushed the door open. The room was standard: double bed, a small desk, a TV mounted on the wall. A single window overlooked the street below, the neon sign from the diner across the road casting a dim red glow through the thin curtains. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, grateful to be off my feet. That's when I noticed it. The air in the room was thick, almost stifling, and there was a strange, sweet smell that I couldn't quite place, like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic. I got up, opening the window a crack to let in some fresh air, but the smell didn't go away. It just lingered, cloying and heavy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the old carpet or the plumbing. I unpacked a few things, changed into my pajamas, and turned on the TV, hoping for some mindless background noise to lull me to sleep. The screen flickered to life, but the picture was grainy, the sound distorted. I flipped through the channels, but all of them were the same: static, broken images, and garbled voices that seemed to blend together in an unsettling cacophony. Frustrated, I turned off the TV and climbed into bed. I was exhausted, but I couldn't seem to relax. The room felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it. A soft, barely perceptible whisper, like someone was standing just behind me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. I sat up, heart racing, but the room was empty. Just the dim red light from the window and the shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far across the walls. I lay back down, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe voices from another room carrying through the thin walls. But the whispering didn't stop. It was constant, ebbing and flowing like a distant conversation that I was never meant to hear. I turned on the bedside lamp, its weak glow barely piercing the darkness, and strained to listen. The whispers were faint, but they were there, distinct, insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded angry, urgent. I got up and checked the room, pulling open the closet, looking under the bed, even checking the bathroom. Nothing. No sign of anyone else. Just my own reflection staring back at me from the mirror, pale and tired, eyes wide with a fear I didn't want to acknowledge. I tried to call the front desk, but the phone was dead. No dial tone, no static, just silence. My cell phone was on the nightstand, but when I picked it up, the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on, no matter how many times I pressed the power button. I was starting to panic. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and I could swear I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I grabbed my keycard and bolted out of the room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't stop until I reached the elevator, jamming the button repeatedly until the doors creaked open. The ride down was agonizingly slow, the elevator shuddering and groaning as it descended. When the doors finally opened, I rushed into the lobby, the familiar smell of mildew a strange comfort. The clerk was still at the desk, her head down, eyes fixed on her computer screen. I approached, my nerves frayed, and tried to explain what had happened. "There's something wrong with my room," I said, my voice shaking. "I keep hearing whispers and the phone isn't working." She looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. "Room 917?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes," I said, hoping for some reassurance, some explanation. She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders slumping as if under some invisible weight. "Room 917 is supposed to be closed off," she said quietly, almost to herself. "It's not supposed to be occupied." "What do you mean?" I demanded, confusion giving way to frustration. "I just checked in. You gave me the key." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or fear. "I didn't give you that key," she said softly. "I wouldn't. No one should be in that room." I stared at her, my mind racing. "But I was just in there," I insisted. "Who else has access?" She shook her head. "No one. That room's been locked for years, ever since—" She trailed off, glancing over her shoulder at the old framed newspaper clippings on the wall behind her. One in particular caught my eye. A headline from decades ago, yellowed with age. "Murder-suicide in room 917. Couple found dead in apparent tragedy." My heart sank as I read the names beneath the headline. A young couple, newlyweds, who had checked in for their honeymoon and never checked out. The article said they were found the next morning, the room in disarray, their bodies cold and lifeless on the bed. No one knew what happened, but guests afterward complained of strange noises, whispers, and the feeling of being watched. The hotel had closed off room 917 after that, the clerk explained, claiming it was due to renovations that never seemed to happen. But no matter what they did, no matter how many times they locked the door, guests still reported seeing lights on in the room, hearing muffled voices late at night. I turned to the clerk, my skin crawling. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head. "You were never supposed to be in there," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how you got that key." I didn't stay to argue. I grabbed my bags and left, driving through the night. The image of that headline burned into my mind. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was just a strange coincidence, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that room. I still travel for work, still stay in hotels, but every time I check in, I make sure to ask for a different room. And if I ever see room 9117 on the key card, I know to walk away. Because some rooms are meant to stay locked. Their secrets buried in the past. And I've learned the hard way that some whispers never really go away. I've always been fascinated by old buildings, especially those with a sense of history, etched into every creak of the floorboards and every chipped corner of a window pane. So when I found a quaint bed and breakfast in a remote town, tucked away in the hills, I thought it would be a perfect place to spend a quiet weekend. Cedar House was charming, an old Victorian mansion with ivy crawling up the stone walls and a wraparound porch that groaned under its age. I arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon, greeted by the innkeeper, Mrs. Fowler, a kindly woman in her 60s with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She gave me the grand tour, her voice filled with pride as she pointed out the vintage furniture, the antique light fixtures, and the array of paintings that lined the walls. "There's a lot of history here," she said as we passed a portrait of a stern-looking man in a top hat. "Cedar House has been in my family for generations. You'll find it's got quite a character of its own." I smiled, eager to settle into the cozy atmosphere. She led me up the grand staircase, the wood creaking underfoot, and stopped outside my room at the end of the hall. "You'll be in room 8, she said, handing me the key. "Breakfast is at 8 sharp. Let me know if you need anything." I thanked her and stepped inside. The room was quaint, with floral wallpaper, a 4-poster bed, and a window that overlooked the sprawling gardens below. The place had a lived-in feel, like stepping back in time to a slower, quieter world. I unpacked and decided to explore the house a bit more. As I wandered the upstairs hallway, I noticed a door at the far end, one that Mrs. Fowler hadn't mentioned during the tour. It was different from the others, a heavy, ornate door with a faded brass handle. I reached out, my curiosity piqued, and tried the handle, but it was locked. A small plaque on the door read, "Private, do not enter." I figured it was probably just a storage room, or maybe Mrs. Fowler's private quarters. Still, something about that door stuck with me, a strange pull that I couldn't quite explain. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the old house settle around me. The wind rattled the windows, and the branches of a nearby tree scraped against the glass. I was on the brink of sleep when I heard it. a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the direction of the locked door. I sat up, straining to listen. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone gently knocking on the wood. I grabbed my robe and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from a dim sconce flickering at the top of the stairs. I tiptoed toward the end of the hall, my pulse quickening with each step. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, and as I got closer, I noticed something else. A faint whispering sound, like a hushed conversation just beyond the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, my heart pounding. The whispers were clearer now, a woman's voice, soft and pleading, though I couldn't make out the words. I knocked gently on the door, hoping Mrs. Fowler might be inside and in need of help. The tapping stopped immediately, replaced by silence. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no response. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I hurried back to my room, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe the old pipes acting up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning I found Mrs. Fowler in the dining room, setting out breakfast. I hesitated, wondering if I should bring up the noises from the night before. She looked up, smiling as if nothing was amiss. I decided not to mention it. After all, I didn't want to come off as a paranoid guest on the first day. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, pouring me a cup of coffee. "Yeah," I lied, taking the cup with a forced smile. "It's a beautiful place." She beamed. "I'm glad you like it. We don't get many guests out here anymore, but those who come seem to appreciate the charm." I nodded, but my mind kept drifting back to that locked door. I spent the day wandering the town, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. When I returned to Cedar House that evening, I caught Mrs. Fowler on the phone, her voice low and urgent, but she quickly hung up when she saw me. "Just checking in on an old friend," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. That night, the tapping started again, louder this time, insistent. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the sound gnawing at my nerves. The whispers returned, a soft, mournful murmur that seemed to seep through the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbing my phone for light, and made my way to the locked door. I stood there, my hand hovering over the handle. The whispers were clearer now, a desperate, pleading tone that sent chills through me. I tried the handle again, hoping maybe it had been left unlocked, but it was still firmly shut. I knocked, a little harder this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone in there?" The whisper stopped abruptly. I pressed my ear against the door, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, suddenly, a loud bang shook the door, as if something had slammed against it from the other side. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The banging continued intermittently throughout the night, rattling the walls and filling the hallway with an angry, relentless noise. I lay in bed, clutching the blankets, waiting for it to stop. The next morning, I confronted Mrs. Fowler as soon as I saw her. "What's behind that door?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard noises all night. It sounded like someone was trapped." Her expression hardened, the warmth from the previous day gone. "That room is private," she said firmly. "No one goes in there. It's best you forget about it." I wanted to push further, but there was a finality in her tone that made me hesitate. She turned away, busily setting the table, and I knew the conversation was over. I packed my bags that afternoon, deciding to cut my stay short. Whatever was happening in that house, I wanted no part of it. Before I left, I took one last look at the locked door. It stood there, silent and unassuming, as if daring me to try it one more time. I shook my head, turning away, but just as I was about to walk down the stairs, I noticed something, a faint scratch on the wood near the bottom of the door. I crouched down, my breath catching in my throat. It was a name scratched into the wood in shaky, desperate letters. Evelyn. I didn't know what it meant, but it filled me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I hurried out of the house, barely saying goodbye to Mrs. Fowler, and drove away without looking back. A few weeks later, I couldn't resist the urge to do some digging. I searched online, combing through old records and articles about Cedar House. That's when I found it, a small newspaper clipping from the local archives dated 50 years ago. Local woman, Evelyn Fowler, reported missing. Last seen at family Cedar House estate. Police search yields no leads. The picture showed a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She looked just like Mrs. Fowler, only much younger. The article mentioned that she was last seen arguing with her sister, the current innkeeper, who claimed she had no idea where Evelyn went. The case went cold, the mystery unsolved. I never went back to Cedar House, but sometimes late at night I think about that locked door and the whispers that seem to come from the walls. I wonder if Evelyn is still there, trapped behind that door, trying to tell her story in the only way she can. And I wonder how many other guests have heard her whispers, only to leave with unanswered questions and the feeling that some doors should never be opened. I've always loved finding unique items at estate sales. There's something thrilling about sifting through the remnants of someone else's life, hunting for hidden treasures among the clutter. It was on one of these hunts that I found it, a large antique family portrait tucked away in the corner of a dusty attic. The painting was beautifully detailed, showing a family of 4 standing in front of an old farmhouse. The parents stood at the back, stern and proper, dressed in Victorian attire, their expressions almost regal. In front of them were 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was about 10, his expression blank and eyes dull. The girl was younger, maybe 6, with long dark hair and a hauntingly vacant stare. What struck me most, though, was the artist's skill. Every detail, from the fabric of their clothes to the way the light hit their eyes, was captured so perfectly it almost felt like a photograph. The seller let it go for a steal, saying she didn't know much about it, just that it had been in the house for as long as anyone could remember. I figured it would be a perfect addition to my growing collection of vintage oddities. I brought the portrait home and hung it in my living room, proud of my find. It added a certain atmosphere to the room, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. An eerie elegance, maybe. The first night, I admired it while watching TV, occasionally glancing up at the faces staring back at me from the wall. But as the evening wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The eyes of the family seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation that grew stronger as the night went on. Every time I looked away, I felt their gaze pressing into the back of my neck, like they were watching my every move. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I turned off the TV and got up to head to bed, I swore I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a flicker, a twitch from within the frame. I spun around staring at the painting, my heart pounding. The family stared back, frozen in place. Nothing had changed, but the room felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself to look away and went to bed, trying to convince myself that it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind. That night, I had the most vivid dreams. I was standing in the old farmhouse from the portrait, walking through rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air was thick and heavy, and everything was cloaked in shadows that shifted and swirled as I moved. I wandered through hallways that twisted and turned in impossible ways, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As I explored, I heard faint whispers coming from behind the walls. Soft at first, like the distant murmur of voices just beyond reach. They grew louder, more frantic, overlapping in a cacophony that filled my head and made it impossible to think. I stumbled into a room at the end of a long corridor, and there they were, the family from the portrait, sitting around a dining table. Their eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, their faces twisted into unnatural grins that stretched far too wide. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The whispers lingered in my ears, fading slowly as I sat up in bed, gasping for breath. It was just a dream, I told myself. But the uneasy feeling lingered long after I was awake. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the portrait. I spent hours staring at it, studying every detail. That's when I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The children's eyes. They weren't vacant like I remembered. There was something behind them now, a glimmer of something dark, almost hungry. I backed away, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd just overlooked it before, or maybe the light was hitting it differently. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something had changed, and it wasn't just in my head. I decided to do some research on the painting, hoping to find out more about its origins. I spent hours online, combing through art forums and databases, but found nothing. No record of the artist, no mention of the family, nothing. It was as if the painting didn't exist. Frustrated, I called the seller to ask if she knew anything more. She sounded surprised to hear from me and said she didn't know much, only that the house where she found it had been abandoned for decades, ever since the last owners had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. They were never found, she said. But rumors about strange noises and eerie sightings around the house had kept people away. My unease deepened. I hung up and stared at the portrait again. The family looked back, their expressions still, but I could feel something different now. A tension in the air, like they were waiting for something. That night I moved the painting into the spare room and shut the door, hoping to keep whatever was unsettling me contained. But as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The faint sound of whispers drifting through the walls. They were louder now, more urgent, and I could make out individual voices, though the words were still unclear. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a frantic, desperate chorus. Then came the tapping, a soft, rhythmic knock that sent a jolt of fear through me. It was coming from the spare room, directly across from my bedroom. I got up, my hands shaking, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, and the tapping continued, steady and insistent. I crept toward the spare room, my breath hitching with each step. As I reached for the doorknob, the tapping stopped. I hesitated, my hand trembling, before finally pushing the door open. The room was empty, the portrait leaning against the far wall, covered with a sheet. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. The sheet was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if being pulled from underneath. I froze, staring as it lifted slightly, revealing the bottom of the frame. My heart pounded in my chest, and I backed away, not wanting to see whatever was behind it. Then, all at once, the sheet flew off, revealing the portrait in its entirety. The family's expressions had changed. The parents were no longer stern. They were grinning, their eyes gleaming with malice. The children were smiling too, but their faces were distorted, twisted into grotesque parodies of joy. The boy's mouth was too wide, his teeth too sharp, and the girl's eyes were black voids, staring directly at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and fled the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I barricaded myself in my bedroom, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, filling the house with their unbearable noise. I could feel them pressing in from all sides, closing in on me, suffocating me. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up it was daylight. The house was quiet again, the whispers gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I left the house without looking at the spare room, my only thought to get rid of the portrait as quickly as possible. I took it to a junkyard on the edge of town, tossing it into a pile of broken furniture and scrap metal. I watched as they crushed it, the sound of shattering wood and glass a grim satisfaction. I hoped it would be enough, hoped that whatever had been trapped in that portrait would finally be gone. But even now I can't escape it. At night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant. They come from the walls, from the corners of the room, from the places where shadows linger a little too long. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them, The family staring back at me from the darkness, their smiles wide and their eyes hungry, waiting. I've always been drawn to abandoned places. There's something about the stillness, the way time seems to pause, that calls to me. Maybe it's the solitude, or maybe I just like poking around where I shouldn't. Either way, that's how I found myself standing in front of an old, decrepit house on the outskirts of town one chilly October evening. It was one of those nights where the sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind cut right through you, making your breath fog up in the air. Perfect for a little urban exploration. The house was a rotting carcass of what might have once been a grand mansion. Its windows were shattered, the front door hung off its hinges, and the paint was peeling off in strips, like dead skin. There was an unsettling energy about it, a heaviness in the air that made my skin prickle. I hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The air was stale and reeked of mold, like a tomb sealed for too long. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing water-stained wallpaper and warped floorboards. Every step I took made the wood groan beneath my weight. As I moved deeper into the house, I could hear the faint whisper of the wind through the broken windows, like the house was breathing. I reminded myself that it was just the wind. Just the wind. I wandered through the rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last, until I found myself in what I guessed was the living room. There was a massive fireplace, its stone surface blackened with soot, and above it an old dusty portrait of a family hung crookedly on the wall. I shined my flashlight on it. The faces were faded, but I could make out a man, a woman, and a little girl. Their eyes seemed to follow me, dark and accusing. I shook off the chill running down my spine and turned away, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was coming from upstairs. I swallowed hard, my curiosity battling with a growing sense of dread. This was what I came for, wasn't it? A real scare, a story to tell. I crept up the staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the end of the hallway behind a closed door. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped the doorknob. The metal was icy cold, and for a moment, I thought I might turn back. But then the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket. I had to know what was behind that door. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair in the corner, slowly swaying back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting there. I felt a rush of cold air, colder than anything I'd felt outside, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The chair creaked to a stop, and that's when I saw it. On the floor, scratched into the wood, were words. They were Jack's head, erratic, like they'd been carved in a frenzy. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw movement in the shadows. I knelt down, shining my light on the scratches. The words were barely legible, but I could make them out. Get out. They're watching. A chill ran through me, deeper than fear, more primal. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, to swell, creeping closer. I bolted, racing down the stairs, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness. As I reached the bottom, I heard it again, the tapping, now a furious, rapid pounding. I didn't look back. I burst through the front door, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running until I was outside, gulping down the cold night air. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to calm the panic surging through me. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent once more. I fumbled for my phone, needing to hear another human voice, to tether myself back to reality. But as I unlocked the screen, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The screen was filled with photos, hundreds of them, of me. From inside the house, every angle, every room I'd been in, each one taken from just behind me. My breath hitched as I scrolled through, my hands shaking. In the last photo, I was standing in front of the fireplace, the one with the portrait. But this time, the faces were different. They weren't faded or lifeless. They were staring straight ahead, their eyes wide and hungry. The little girl's mouth was twisted into a grin, her eyes fixed on me. And there, in the corner of the photo, I could see it. The faint outline of a figure, half-formed, blending with the shadows, watching me. I dropped the phone, the screen cracking against the pavement, and backed away. I never should have gone in there. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, mocking whisper that chilled me to my core. I ran then as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone anymore, that something had followed me out of that house, something that wasn't going to let me go. And as I reached the safety of the streetlights, I could still feel those eyes on me, watching, waiting. I never went back to that house, but sometimes late at night I swear I hear it. The tapping, coming from just outside my window, as if someone's trying to remind me that I was warned. And that next time, I might not be so lucky. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. I'd always been the logical type, the one who finds an explanation for every creak and groan in the night. So when my friend David called me up about a strange job, I took it as a joke. He was into the paranormal. You know, the type who'd spend his weekends hunting for spirits in crumbling old buildings. But this time it was different. This time, he sounded scared. David told me about a house on the outskirts of town. Not just any house, but a mansion, sprawling and ancient, left to rot for decades. It was one of those places that kids dared each other to go near but never did. The locals called it the Crow House, after the family that once lived there. Rumor had it, they all disappeared one night, and no one saw them again. The place had been empty ever since, boarded up and forgotten, until recently. David said someone had bought it, planning to renovate, only they couldn't keep any workers. People quit on the first day, babbling about strange noises and shadows that moved on their own. David needed someone who wouldn't scare easily. He needed me. The money was good, too good. All I had to do was stay there for one night, document everything, and confirm it was just an old house with nothing to fear. Easy enough. I agreed, thinking it'd be a simple job, maybe a creepy story to tell later. I showed up just before dusk, my car kicking up dust on the long, overgrown driveway. The house loomed ahead, a silhouette against the fading sky. It was massive, with towers and spires that jutted out like bones piercing through decaying flesh. The windows were black and empty, gaping mouths and a skeletal face. I felt a chill, but I shook it off. Just nerves, I told myself. David was already there, his car parked at the edge of the property. He handed me a camera and a flashlight, his hands shaking as he did. He didn't want to come inside, he said. Something about the place gave him the creeps. I laughed it off, but the look in his eyes stayed with me as I walked up the steps. There was a desperation there, like he was hoping I'd change my mind. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Inside, it was even worse than I'd expected. Cobwebs draped over every surface, and the air was thick with dust. The house smelled old, like damp wood and mildew, with an undercurrent of something else, something metallic and sharp. I started my walk through, snapping photos as I went. The house was a maze of dark hallways and cold, empty rooms. I felt a creeping unease, but I kept moving, determined to prove David wrong. Every now and then I'd hear a soft thud or the rustling of something unseen, but I chalked it up to the house settling or rodents scurrying in the walls. It wasn't until I reached the basement that things started to go wrong. The door was at the end of a narrow hallway, barely visible in the dim light. It was heavy, old, with iron hinges that groaned as I pulled it open. The steps creaked under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the stone walls. I reached the bottom, and that's when I saw it. There, in the middle of the basement, was a circle of old, rotting chairs. They were arranged in a perfect ring facing inward, like some kind of twisted ritual had taken place. In the center of the circle, the floor was scorched, the wood blackened as if something had been burned there. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to move closer, snapping a photo. That's when I heard it, a soft whisper barely audible like the wind but wrong. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the chairs and the charred floor. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. I turned to head back up the stairs, but the door at the top slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed up, my flashlight flickering wildly, and threw myself against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, calling for David, but all I heard in response was silence. Deep, suffocating silence. That's when I felt it, like a breath on the back of my neck. Cold, wet, and reeking of decay. I spun around, shining my light into the basement, but it barely cut through the darkness, and then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them peering out from the shadows, watching me. They were everywhere, nestled in the walls, in the ceiling, staring with a hungry intensity. I backed away, my breath hitching, but the eyes followed me, unblinking and predatory. They moved closer, the darkness around them pulsing like it was alive. I fumbled with my camera, snapping pictures wildly, as if capturing them would somehow make them less real. But with every flash, the eyes seemed to multiply, swelling in number and intensity. My flashlight died, plunging me into darkness, but the eyes remained, glowing faintly in the pitch black. I screamed for David, banging on the door, but my voice was swallowed by the dark. The eyes moved closer, and I could feel something cold and slick brushing against my skin, like tendrils reaching out to pull me in. I pressed myself against the door, my mind racing with fear, as the whispering grew louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The door flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. David was there, his face pale and twisted with fear. He grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the house, not stopping until we were both in his car, the engine roaring to life. We didn't speak as he sped down the driveway, away from the house and the eyes that still haunted my vision. When we finally stopped miles away, David turned to me, his eyes wide and desperate. He asked to see the photos to prove that what we'd seen was real. I handed him the camera, my hand still shaking. He scrolled through the pictures, his face growing paler with each one. I leaned over, looking at the screen, and felt my stomach drop. Every photo was the same. There were no eyes, no shadows, just me standing alone in the basement, staring at the circle of chairs. I was in every picture. The camera somehow turned back on me, but my face was wrong, twisted, grinning. And in every photo behind me, just barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, as if it were screaming in silent laughter. David looked at me, his face white with horror, and I realized what he was seeing. My reflection in the car window. My eyes staring back at him, hollow and empty, just like the eyes in the basement. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories, the kind you hear about on late-night radio shows or see in those low-budget documentaries. I've never believed in the paranormal, not really. That was until I spent a night at the Grand Hotel, an old place that had seen better days but was still trying to cling to its former glory. My company had sent me there for a work trip, and I booked a room on the top floor because it was cheaper. Nobody seemed to want those rooms. I didn't think much of it. How bad could it be? The Grand was one of those places that felt like it was stuck in time. The carpets were threadbare, the wallpaper was peeling, and the light fixtures were dim and flickered. It was the kind of hotel where every floorboard creaked and every door seemed to groan in protest when opened. The staff were polite enough, but there was something off about them, like they were too tired or too wary to make eye contact for too long. I got my key, an actual metal key, not a card, and took the elevator up. The ride was slow, the kind that makes you feel every floor like you're sinking underwater. When I stepped out, the hallway was dimly lit, the lights buzzing softly. It was quiet, unnervingly so. The only sound was the faint hum of the elevator doors closing behind me. My room, 1408, was at the far end of the hall. As I walked, I noticed that every other door was shut tight, and I couldn't hear a single noise from any of the other rooms. No TVs, no voices, nothing. The door to 1408 was heavy and resisted as I pushed it open. Inside, it was just as dated as the rest of the hotel. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were drawn, and there was a faint, musty smell, like the room hadn't been aired out in years. I threw my bag on the bed and decided to check the place out. There was a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, a small closet, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. Everything seemed normal, if not a bit depressing. I was tired from the drive, so I figured I'd crash early. I got into bed, turned off the light, and that's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. I sat up, squinting in the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The room felt colder than before, a chill that seeped into my bones. I told myself it was just an old hotel, nothing to worry about. I lay back down, pulled the covers tight, and closed my eyes. But then it came again. Rustle, rustle, like someone dragging a cloth slowly across the floor. I sat up again, heart pounding, and fumbled for the bedside lamp. The light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room, but there was nothing there. I was alone. I laughed nervously, feeling ridiculous. It was just my imagination. I turned off the light and lay back down. Minutes passed in silence, and just as I was about to drift off, the rustling started again, louder this time, like it was right beside the bed. I bolted upright, the light flickering on as my hand shot out for the switch. My eyes scanned the room, but nothing was out of place. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I got up, checked the closet, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing. I decided I wasn't getting any sleep, so I turned on the TV, flipping through static-filled channels. It was just noise, but it was better than the silence. I lay back, eyes on the flickering screen, trying to keep my mind from wandering. That's when I noticed it. The faint reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. A shadow, standing just behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The shadow was gone, but I could feel it, a heavy presence like someone was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a distortion from the cracked glass, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rustling started again, now accompanied by a faint whispering. It was soft, almost inaudible, like someone muttering just under their breath. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. I turned up the TV, trying to drown out the noise, but it only got louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk, my voice shaky. Is there anyone else on this floor?" I asked. The man on the other end hesitated. "No, sir, the top floor is closed for renovation. You're the only guest up there." I hung up, my hands trembling. I didn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the room felt colder than ever. I could see my breath fogging in the air. I grabbed my bag, deciding I'd rather sleep in my car than spend another minute in that room. As I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the walls. The lights flickered, casting shadows that twisted and writhed as if they were alive. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but my voice was drowned out by the deafening roar that filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door swung open easily, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, all 6 flights, my footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. When I reached the lobby, the staff at the front desk looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Is everything all right, sir?" one of them asked. I couldn't find the words. I just shook my head and handed over the key. "I'm leaving," I muttered. The clerk nodded like he'd heard it all before. "You stayed in 1408, didn't you?" he said softly. I stopped, staring at him. "Yeah, why?" He sighed, exchanging a knowing look with the other clerk. "You're not the first. That room, we don't usually book it. People say it's, haunted. The Crow family used to stay there years ago before they vanished. That was their favorite room." I left without another word, my mind racing. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, but it was just me. Just me and the empty road. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me from that room. Weeks later, I developed the photos I'd taken on my trip, looking for something to ground me back in reality. Most were unremarkable. Landscapes, city streets, the usual. But then I saw it, buried among the rest. A photo I didn't remember taking. It was the inside of 1408, taken from just inside the doorway. And there, standing by the bed, was a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes staring straight at the camera. It was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something out of another century. The whispering started up again in my head, faint but unmistakable, and I knew then that it wasn't just the room that was haunted. It was me, and whatever was in that room, it wasn't done with me yet. I never believed in the supernatural. To me, it was always a bunch of nonsense made up to scare people who didn't know any better. I prided myself on being rational, on needing evidence and proof before I accepted anything as real. That's why I laughed it off when my sister Emma called me, her voice shaking, telling me she needed help with something she swore was paranormal. Emma had recently moved into an old Victorian house on the edge of town, a place she got for a steal because of its rundown state. It was one of those grand, looming places that had probably been beautiful once but now looked like it had been forgotten by time. Emma was excited about fixing it up, even though it had a creepy reputation. There were stories about the house, whispers about the original owner, a reclusive woman who never left and was rumored to have died there alone. I drove over, expecting to find Emma scared by creaky floorboards or the wind rattling the old windows. She greeted me at the door, looking pale and frazzled, a stark contrast to her usual upbeat self. She pulled me inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder like she was worried someone, or something, was watching. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "You sounded freaked out on the phone." Emma led me through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silent rooms. "It's the mirrors," she said quietly. I think there's something wrong with them." I couldn't help but snort. "Mirrors? Really?" She shot me a glare. "I'm serious, Alex. Every mirror in this house is wrong. I keep seeing things that shouldn't be there." I followed her up to the second floor, feeling the temperature drop as we ascended. The hallway was lined with dusty portraits, their subjects watching us with hollow eyes. Emma stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror that hung at the end of the hall. It was beautiful in a Gothic sort of way, with intricate carvings around the frame. The glass, however, was dark and seemed to ripple like water under the dim light. "I tried getting rid of it," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I tried moving it, covering it, even breaking it. But every time it's just there again, like it never left." I stared at the mirror, my skepticism wavering. I reached out, running my fingers along the cold, smooth surface. It felt normal, solid. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my head, but the hallway was empty. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. I stepped back, my heart beating a little faster. "All right, that's weird. I'll give you that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's probably just some kind of optical illusion. Old glass can warp over time, make things look strange." Emma shook her head. It's not just that. I've seen myself in the mirror, but it's not me. It moves differently, smiles when I'm not smiling. Last night I walked past and I swear it was standing there staring at me from the other side. I looked at her, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. Emma wasn't the type to scare easily, and she definitely wasn't one to make things up. I turned back to the mirror, peering closer. My reflection did the same, of course, but as I moved to the side, I thought I saw it hesitate, like it was considering whether to follow me or not. I blinked and it was gone, moving perfectly in sync with me once more. This is nuts, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. You said you tried to cover it? Emma nodded. It won't stay covered. The sheets just fall off. Or when I turn around, it's uncovered again. I don't know what to do. Determined to prove that this was just some weird trick, I grabbed a sheet from the nearby room and tossed it over the mirror. It stayed put. I turned to Emma with a triumphant smile, but she just looked past me, her eyes widening in horror. Alex, she whispered, her voice trembling. Look. I turned back to the mirror. The sheet was gone, lying crumpled on the floor. And my reflection, it wasn't me anymore. It stood there, grinning a wide, unnatural smile, its eyes dark and hollow. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the reflection didn't move. It just watched me, smiling that eerie smile. Okay, that's enough, I stammered, grabbing Emma's arm. We're leaving. Now. We rushed down the stairs, but every room we passed had mirrors, and in each one our reflections stood still, watching us with that same sinister grin. It felt like the house itself was alive, like it was breathing us in. We reached the front door, yanking it open and stumbling into the daylight. We drove to my place, not saying a word. Emma was shaking, her hands clenched tight in her lap. I tried to think of something to say, something that would make sense of what we'd seen, but my mind was blank. For a few days, things seemed to go back to normal. Emma stayed with me, refusing to go back to the house, and I didn't press her. But then the nightmares started. I'd see that mirror in my dreams, the reflection that wasn't mine, following me, mocking me with that awful smile. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, feeling like someone had been watching me all night. Then one evening, as I was brushing my teeth, I looked up and saw it. My reflection, standing still, grinning at me with those hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just out of sight, waiting. I rushed to Emma, my heart pounding. We need to do something about that house, I told her. Burn it, sell it, I don't care, we can't let it stay like that. Emma nodded, her face pale. I know, but it's not just the house, Alex, it's everywhere. I've seen it in your mirrors, too. I froze, feeling a cold dread settle over me. We walked through my apartment, checking every mirror, every reflective surface. And sure enough, there they were, our reflections, standing just a little too still, grinning just a little too wide. That's when we realized the truth. Whatever was in that house, it had followed us. It wasn't just the mirrors. It was in them, watching, waiting. And no matter where we went, no matter what we did, it would always be there. We covered every mirror, every shiny surface, but it didn't matter. The reflection still watched us from the corners of our eyes, smiling that awful smile. We never figured out what they wanted, but we knew one thing for sure. They weren't reflections anymore, they were us, and one day they were going to take our place. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the quiet of the wilderness, the feeling of being surrounded by nothing but trees and sky. That's like therapy for me. That's why when I had the chance to take a solo trip to Pine Ridge National Park, I jumped on it. It's one of the more remote parks, miles of untouched forest, jagged cliffs, and sprawling trails that aren't marked on any map. Perfect for getting away from everything. I planned to spend a week there, hiking by day and camping under the stars by night. It was late autumn, so the crowds had thinned out, and I'd have the trails mostly to myself. Exactly how I liked it. I loaded up my gear, drove out to the trailhead, and set off. The air was crisp, the leaves were a vibrant patchwork of reds and golds, and everything seemed perfect. On the second day, I decided to venture deeper into the park, away from the more popular trails. I'd heard rumors from other hikers about a hidden lake, tucked away in the heart of the forest, where the water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom. But the path there was tricky, barely more than a game trail, winding through dense pines that seemed to grow closer together the further I went. I was about halfway to where I thought the lake might be when I stumbled upon something strange. It was a clearing, surrounded by tall pines that whispered softly in the breeze. In the center of the clearing stood an old crumbling cabin, half swallowed by the forest. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of years, and the windows were dark and empty. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd seen, and I was sure there wasn't supposed to be any structures this deep in the park. I felt a twinge of unease, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached the cabin, noticing how quiet it was around me. The usual forest sounds, birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, had all but disappeared. The only noise was the faint whispering of the wind through the pines. I peered through one of the windows, but the inside was pitch black. My flashlight was in my pack, so I took it out, clicked it on, and shined it inside. The cabin was empty except for a small, worn table and a single chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, odd shapes and spirals that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. A shiver ran down my spine, and I stepped back. The air seemed colder here, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like someone speaking just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind, and turned to leave. But as I stepped away from the cabin, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, soft and insistent, calling my name. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one out here. No one who should know my name. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I quickened my pace, heading back the way I'd come, but the whispering followed me, growing more urgent, more desperate. It sounded like a chorus of voices now, overlapping and echoing through the forest, all calling my name. I broke into a jog, then a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path twisting and turning, until I wasn't sure which way I was going anymore. I stopped to catch my breath, my heart hammering in my chest, and tried to get my bearings. That's when I noticed the silence. The whispering had stopped, but so had everything else. No wind, no rustling leaves, just dead, suffocating quiet. I checked my GPS, but the screen flickered and went black. The compass on my watch spun wildly, unable to find north. Panic set in. I was lost, deep in the forest, with no idea how to get back to my camp. I turned in circles, trying to remember the way I'd come, when I saw it, the cabin, standing right in front of me, even though I was sure I'd run in the opposite direction. My stomach churned as I realized I hadn't moved at all. Somehow, no matter which way I went, I ended up back at that cabin. The door was open now, swinging slightly as if inviting me in. I took a step back, but the whispering returned, louder than before. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside my head, swirling and overlapping until I couldn't tell one from another. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were pleading, begging me to come closer. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I took a step toward the cabin, and then another. I reached the doorway, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hand, and peered inside. The symbols on the wall seemed to move, writhing like worms under the light. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging the cabin into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The whispering was deafening now, the voices frantic and desperate. And I could feel someone moving around me, brushing past me in the dark. I stumbled back, reaching for the door, but the handle was gone. The walls felt slick and cold, like wet stone, and the cymbals burned under my touch. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices that filled the cabin, echoing off the walls and drowning out my own panicked breaths. I could feel them all around me, pressing in, pulling me deeper into the dark. I clawed at the wall, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. Just endless, suffocating darkness and those terrible, pleading voices. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was trapped in the cabin, and the next, I was lying in the clearing, gasping for air. The cabin was gone, the forest silent once more. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching, and looked around. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I checked my gear. My GPS was working again, showing me a clear path back to the trailhead. I didn't look back as I made my way out of the forest, the whispering still echoing faintly in my ears. I reached my car just as night fell, and I drove out of Pine Ridge without stopping, not even to catch my breath. I left everything behind, my tent, my gear, my sense of safety in the wilderness. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that forest. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, hear faint whispers in the dead of night. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew the truth. Whatever was in that cabin, it had found me, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it was never going to let me go. The voices were clearer now, not just whispering, but speaking, calling my name in the stillness of my empty apartment. Last night, I woke to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. I got up, heart pounding, and checked every room, but no one was there. Just the silence, stretching long and deep, in the faint, unmistakable scent of pine. I think it's only a matter of time before I find myself back at that cabin, whether I want to or not. And this time I'm not sure I'll be able to leave. I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, crisscrossing the country and spending more nights on the road than I can count. It's a job that gets in your blood, and you either love it or you don't last. I've seen my share of strange things, freak weather, oddball hitchhikers, and deserted gas stations that feel like they belong in another time. But there's one stretch of road I'll never forget, one that still makes me shiver every time I think about it. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was hauling a load of auto parts through a remote part of the Midwest, the kind of place where the towns are few and far between, and the only company you have is the occasional deer darting across the highway. I was tired but determined to make it to my destination by morning, so I kept my foot on the gas and my eyes on the road. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty stretch of asphalt ahead. It was just me, my rig, and the endless road. There wasn't another car in sight, not even a distant pair of headlights to break the monotony. As I drove, I noticed something strange, a thick fog rolling in, sudden and unnatural, like a wall of smoke creeping across the ground. I've driven through my share of fog, but this was different. It was dense, almost solid, and it swallowed everything in its path. My headlights barely cut through it, casting an eerie glow that made the shadows dance along the roadside. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. My GPS flickered, then went blank, the screen displaying nothing but static. I tapped it, but it stayed dead. Great, I thought. Just what I needed. Lost in the middle of nowhere with no map and no directions. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Typical. I kept driving, hoping the fog would lift, but it only grew thicker, pressing in around my truck like a heavy blanket. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the familiar mile markers and signs nowhere to be seen. It was like I'd entered another world, one where time and distance had no meaning. After what felt like hours, I saw something up ahead, a faint glow, like the distant lights of a town. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone out here after all. As I got closer, the lights took shape, revealing an old, run-down diner on the side of the road. The kind of place you'd see in a black and white movie, with neon signs flickering and peeling paint on the walls. I pulled into the gravel lot, my tires crunching loudly in the silence. The diner looked deserted, but the lights were on, buzzing softly in the fog. I figured it was as good a place as any to stretch my legs and get my bearings, maybe grab a cup of coffee to keep me going. I climbed out of the cab, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. The diner's windows were fogged over and I couldn't see inside. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling weakly, and stepped in. The place was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of life. The booths were covered in dust, the tables set with untouched plates and silverware like the whole place had been abandoned in a hurry. I called out, but my voice echoed in the silence. No answer, just the hum of the lights and the distant rumble of my truck's engine. I wandered over to the counter, noticing how everything looked old, as if it had been sitting there for decades. The menu on the wall advertised prices that hadn't been seen since the 1950s, and the cash register was one of those antique models with big, clunky buttons. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, like I'd stepped into a place that time had forgotten. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get back to my truck, when I noticed the clock on the wall. It was ticking, but the hands weren't moving forward. They were going backward, slowly ticking off the seconds in reverse. A chill ran down my spine, and I bolted for the door. As I pushed it open, I heard it. The soft hum of voices, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deep inside the diner. I froze, listening. It was a low murmur, like a conversation just out of earshot, the words indistinct but urgent. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The fog had thickened and my truck was barely visible, a shadowy outline in the mist. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door behind me, and fired up the engine. The radio crackled to life, but instead of music or static, I heard those same voices from the diner, louder now, clearer. They were whispering my name. I yanked the radio knob, but it wouldn't turn off. The voices grew more insistent, overlapping and echoing in a dissonant chorus. I floored the gas, pulling out of the lot and back onto the road, the tires slipping on the slick pavement. I drove blindly, the fog swallowing everything around me, the road twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The diner's neon sign flickered in my rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a distant glow, then nothing. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me, filling the cab, whispering my name over and over, like a chant. I drove for what felt like hours, the fog never lifting, the road never changing. I passed the same trees, the same stretches of asphalt over and over, like I was caught in some kind of loop. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, my eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of life, any break in the endless fog. And then up ahead I saw it again. The diner exactly as I'd left it, the neon sign buzzing in the mist. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't possible. I'd been driving away, but here it was, right in front of me like I'd never left. I put the truck in reverse, spinning the wheel, but the road just twisted back on itself, leading me right back to the diner's parking lot. I was trapped, going in circles, no matter how hard I tried to escape. The voices grew louder, filling the cab with their insistent whispering, and I felt a presence, something cold and unseen, pressing against me. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw them. Figures in the fog, standing along the roadside watching me with hollow, empty eyes. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in a black and white photo, and their faces were blank, expressionless. I blinked and they were gone, but the whispers remained, wrapping around me like a shroud. I didn't know what to do. The fog was so thick now I could barely see past the hood of my truck. The GPS was still dead, the radio a constant stream of murmured voices, and every direction I turned, the diner was there, waiting for me. I sat there, engine idling, and watched the clock on the dashboard tick backward, just like the one inside the diner. I realized then that I was stuck, caught in a place that wasn't on any map, where time moved in reverse and the road never led anywhere but back to the beginning. I don't know how long I've been here. The days and nights blend together, and the fog never clears. The diner's lights flicker in the distance, always just ahead, no matter how far I drive. The voices are my only company, whispering my name, telling me to come back, to step inside the diner and join them. I've started to think that maybe that's the only way out, to go back inside, to sit at one of those dusty booths and wait for whatever comes next. But I can't bring myself to do it. Not yet. So I keep driving, round and round, hoping that one day I'll find a way out of this endless loop. But deep down, I know the truth. There is no way out. Not for me. Not for anyone who finds this place. We're all just ghosts on the road, driving in circles, forever lost in the fog. Camping was our thing. Every year, my friends and I would pack up our gear and head out into the wilderness, finding some remote spot to set up camp and escape from the noise of the city. It was a tradition that we'd kept alive since high school, and even though we were all older now, with jobs and responsibilities, we still made the time. This year, we decided to try somewhere new. The Hollow Woods, a dense, sprawling forest about 3 hours out of town. It was perfect. Secluded, quiet, and far enough off the beaten path that we wouldn't have to deal with anyone else. We'd heard stories, of course. Everyone had. The Hollow Woods had a reputation. People said it was cursed, haunted, that anyone who went too deep never came back. But we'd laughed it off. Just urban legends, we thought. We were seasoned campers. We knew how to handle ourselves in the wild. We weren't superstitious. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy smell of moss and pine. We hiked in a couple of miles, finding a clearing by a small stream to set up camp. It was perfect. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night, cracking open beers and sharing stories around the campfire. As the night wore on, the forest grew quiet, unnervingly so. No rustling leaves, no calls of night birds, just a heavy, oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I chalked it up to the isolation, the way the trees seemed to press in on us from all sides. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, the fire started to die down, and the cold crept in. We were laughing about something stupid when we heard it. A distant low whistle like the wind threading through the trees. We paused, glancing at each other. The whistle came again, closer this time and more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. Probably just some animal, Mark said, poking at the fire with a stick. But his voice wavered, betraying the nervousness we all felt. We tried to brush it off, but the whistles continued, now moving through the woods around us, circling our camp like a predator stalking its prey. There was a rhythm to it, an eerie, almost musical cadence that made my skin crawl. We shined our flashlights into the darkness, but the beams barely pierced the dense thicket of trees. I thought I saw movement, a quick flash of something pale darting between the trunks. But when I focused, there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint whisper of the wind. The whistles stopped abruptly, plunging the forest back into silence. We laughed it off, but it was forced, nervous. No one wanted to admit they were scared. We banked the fire and crawled into our tents, trying to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I lay awake, staring at the roof of my tent, listening to every rustle and creak of the forest. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was hard to tell. My eyelids grew heavy, and I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps, soft, slow, circling the campsite. I held my breath, straining to hear. They stopped right outside my tent, so close I could feel the presence of someone, or something, standing just on the other side of the thin fabric. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, but whoever was out there didn't move. I could feel their shadow looming, long and still, casting a chill that seeped through the tent walls. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry. My voice caught in my chest. I lay there, frozen, until finally, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. The next morning I was the first one up. I stepped out of my tent, blinking in the early morning light, and stopped cold. The ground around our camp was covered in tracks, hundreds of them. They were human, bare footprints, but too large and twisted at odd angles, like whoever made them had been walking on broken legs. The tracks circled our tents, overlapping and spiraling out into the woods. "Guys, get up," I called, my voice shaking. "You need to see this." Mark and Jenna crawled out of their tents, rubbing sleep from their eyes, and stopped when they saw the tracks. We stared at them in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud, and they led off in every direction, disappearing into the trees. "This isn't right," Jenna said, her voice barely a whisper. "We should go, now." We didn't need any convincing. We packed up camp in record time, the unease settling into a gnawing panic. The forest felt different now, darker, like the trees were leaning in closer, watching us with unseen eyes. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, the whistling started again, echoing through the woods, following us. It was louder this time, more urgent, like whatever was making it was drawing closer. We picked up the pace, practically running now, but no matter how fast we went, the whistling kept pace, weaving through the trees just out of sight. The trail twisted and turned, and I felt like we were going in circles, the trees all starting to look the same, their branches tangled overhead like skeletal fingers. That's when we saw it, a figure standing in the distance, half hidden behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that didn't seem to fit together right. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were listening to something only it could hear. It was just standing there, motionless, watching us. Then slowly, it raised one long bony arm and pointed, not at us, but to the ground in front of it. The whistling grew louder, shrill and discordant, like nails on a chalkboard, and the figure stepped back, melting into the shadows of the forest. We didn't stick around to see where it went. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the cuts and scrapes from branches that clawed at our clothes. The whistling followed us, relentless and unending, growing fainter as we put distance between us and that thing, but never disappearing completely. When we finally burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot, we were gasping for breath, our clothes torn and muddy. The whistling stopped, and the forest behind us was still and quiet, as if nothing had ever been there. We jumped into the car and sped off, not saying a word until the trees were far behind us. We never spoke about what happened in the hollow woods after that. We never went back, never even considered it. It was like an unspoken pact, one that we all knew we'd keep without question. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear it. That distant, low whistle, drifting through the air like a forgotten tune. And I know deep down that whatever we saw in those woods is still out there, waiting for the next group of campers who think the stories are just that, stories. And I hope, for their sake, they don't venture too deep, because some places aren't meant to be found, and some things should be left alone. I've always been fascinated by true crime and missing persons cases, the way someone can just disappear without a trace. It's like a puzzle that demands to be solved, the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, wondering what really happened. So when I heard about Pine Hollow, a small town up north where people had been vanishing for decades, I knew I had to see it for myself. The disappearances weren't exactly front-page news, they were more like whispers, the kind of stories that spread quietly through towns and never made it past the local papers. Hikers, campers, even locals. People would go into the woods surrounding Pine Hollow and never come out. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. The townspeople didn't like to talk about it, and most blamed it on the treacherous terrain or wild animals. But the numbers were too high, the vanishings too frequent to be explained away so easily. I convinced my friend Sarah to come with me. She's always been up for an adventure, and she loved a good mystery as much as I did. We packed up and drove out, arriving in Pine Hollow on a foggy, drizzly afternoon. The town was small, with a single main street lined with old brick buildings and an eerie stillness that hung in the air. People watched us from their windows, curtains twitching as we drove by, their faces shadowed and suspicious. We checked into a rundown motel on the edge of town, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the gloom. The woman at the front desk eyed us warily when we asked about the disappearances. "You two shouldn't go out there," she said, her voice low and serious. "Those woods, they're not right." But we shrugged it off, figuring she was just another superstitious local. We'd heard the stories, but we weren't planning to do anything stupid. Just a quick hike to get a feel for the place, take some pictures, and maybe find a clue that everyone else had missed. The next morning we set out early, the air heavy with mist that clung to the trees like a shroud. The trailhead was easy enough to find, marked by a faded wooden sign that read, "Hollow Trail." It didn't look like much, just a narrow dirt path winding its way into the dense forest. But as we stepped onto the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we weren't supposed to. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out most of the daylight. We walked for about an hour, the forest growing thicker and the path more overgrown with each step. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the woods were swallowing all sound. Even the birds were silent, and the only noise was the crunch of leaves under our boots. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. Sarah stopped suddenly, her head cocked to the side. "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves. Then, there it was, a soft, distant hum, like the low buzz of electricity, or maybe a swarm of bees. It was coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere off the trail. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shrugged, but her eyes were wide, a mix of curiosity and unease. "Let's check it out." We veered off the trail, pushing through the underbrush, the hum growing louder with each step. It had a strange rhythmic quality to it, like a chant or a song, but not one I'd ever heard before. The air felt heavier, charged, and the hairs on my arms stood up as we moved closer. We stumbled into a small clearing, and that's when we saw it. A circle of stones arranged in a perfect ring, each one etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse and shift when you looked at them too long. In the center of the circle, the ground was bare, the grass scorched and blackened as if something had burned there. The humming was louder now, coming from all around us, though I couldn't see a single thing that could be making the noise. Sarah stepped closer to the circle, her hand outstretched, and I felt a surge of panic. "Don't," I said, grabbing her arm. This doesn't feel right." She hesitated, looking at me, then back at the circle. "Yeah, okay," she muttered, stepping back. "You're right. Let's go." We turned to leave, but the moment we did, the humming stopped, replaced by a sudden, suffocating silence. We froze, glancing at each other. The path we'd taken was gone, swallowed by the forest, and no matter which way we looked, everything seemed the same, endless rows of trees stretching out in every direction. Did we come from this way?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with rising panic. I don't know," I admitted, spinning around, trying to find any landmark, any sign that would point us back to the trail. But it was like the forest had shifted, rearranged itself when we weren't looking. We started walking, picking a direction at random, but the more we walked, the more everything felt wrong. The trees were too close together, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, and the ground seemed to slope downward, pulling us deeper into the woods, no matter which way we turned. We tried to backtrack, but the forest had become a labyrinth, every path leading us in circles. The humming returned, softer now, but constant, like it was following us, echoing through the trees. We quickened our pace, then broke into a run, the panic settling in, but there was no escaping it. We ended up back at the clearing, the circle of stones waiting for us like a trap. But this time, there was something different. A figure stood in the center, tall and thin, draped in shadows. It didn't have a face, not one that I could make out, just a dark, shifting void where a face should be. Sarah screamed, stumbling back, and the figure moved, stepping toward us without a sound. It raised an arm, long and spindly, and pointed to the ground at its feet. I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me toward the circle, and I fought against it, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her back. "Run!" I shouted, but she was frozen, her eyes locked on the figure. The humming grew louder, drilling into my skull, and I felt my grip on her slip. "Sarah!" I yelled, but she didn't respond. She took a step toward the figure, then another, like she was in a trance. I yanked her back, the force nearly knocking us both over, and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that clearing. The trees blurred together and the humming faded, replaced by the sound of our ragged breathing and the pounding of our feet on the forest floor. We didn't stop until we burst out onto the main road, collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for air. We looked back, expecting to see the trees closing in, but the forest was still, quiet, as if it hadn't just tried to swallow us whole. We didn't speak as we stumbled back to the car, our minds racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We drove out of Pine Hollow in silence, the town disappearing in the rearview mirror, and neither of us looked back. We never reported what we saw. Who would believe us? Another pair of strangers passing through, almost becoming another unsolved mystery in a long list of disappearances. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear it again. That low, rhythmic hum, growing louder, drawing closer. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds us again. Because Pine Hollow doesn't just take people, it calls them back. I've spent most of my adult life on the road, jumping from city to city for work. Between flights and meetings, I've stayed in more hotels than I can count. They all start to blend together after a while. The same sterile lobbies, the same beige hallways, the same indifferent service. But there's one hotel I'll never forget, and one room that still haunts me. It was a last-minute business trip to a city I'd never been to before. My usual hotels were all booked up, so my company put me in the Grandwood, an old hotel downtown that had clearly seen better days. The kind of place that might have been glamorous 50 years ago, but now just looked tired and worn out. I arrived late, the lobby nearly deserted except for the desk clerk, an older man with a pinched expression who barely glanced up when I checked in. He handed me a key, a real key, not a card, with a tarnished brass tag that read, Room 615. "6th floor," he mumbled, barely audible over the distant hum of the lobby lights. I thanked him and headed for the elevator, which groaned and shuddered as it carried me up. The hallways were dim, lined with faded wallpaper and flickering lights that cast unsettling shadows on the walls. I made my way to room 615, the end room at the far end of the corridor, and unlocked the door. The room was standard enough, a bed, a desk, a small TV, and a window that overlooked the city. But the air was heavy, almost suffocating, and there was a faint smell of mildew mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. I chalked it up to the age of the place and tried to ignore it. I was exhausted, and all I wanted was to get some sleep. I unpacked, took a quick shower, and climbed into bed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I started to notice the quiet. Too quiet. Even in the dead of night, a city hotel should have some noise. Cars, sirens, the murmur of people in the halls. But here there was nothing, just the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the old building settling. I must have dozed off at some point, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around, but the room was empty. I listened, holding my breath, and there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I got up, my pulse quickening, and walked over to the window. It was dark outside, the city lights casting a faint glow against the glass. But as I peered out, I realized the tapping wasn't from the outside. It was on the inside of the window, right in front of me. I leaned closer, squinting, and froze. There in the reflection was a face, pale, hollow-eyed, with long, tangled hair. It stared back at me from the glass, its mouth moving as if it were whispering something I couldn't hear. My heart slammed in my chest and I stumbled back, knocking over the lamp in my haste. The room plunged into darkness, and when I fumbled the lamp back on, the face was gone. I stood there, breathless, my eyes locked on the window, but the reflection was just mine now, wide-eyed and terrified. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on my exhaustion, but the unease settled deep in my gut. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe some condensation on the window. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I crawled back into bed, leaving the light on, and pulled the covers up to my chin. I lay there, listening to the silence, waiting for sleep to take me. That's when I heard it again. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it wasn't the window. It was coming from the closet. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The closet door was slightly ajar, just enough for darkness to spill out like ink. I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. A draft, maybe? Pipes in the walls? But the tapping was deliberate, too precise to be random. I grabbed my phone and shined its flashlight into the darkness. The closet was empty, just a few hangers swaying gently as if they'd been disturbed. But as I moved the light, I saw something else. Scratches on the inside of the closet door. Deep grooves carved into the wood. My pulse quickened as I realized they weren't random. They formed words, jagged and uneven, as if they'd been scratched in a frenzy. "Help me!" I slammed the closet door shut, my hands trembling. I knew I should leave, go downstairs, demand another room, or just get the hell out of the hotel altogether. But something kept me rooted to the spot, like a morbid curiosity that wouldn't let me walk away. I sat on the bed, my eyes glued to the closet, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then slowly, the tapping started again. Not from the closet this time, but from the bathroom. I turned my head, the flashlight still in my hand, and saw that the bathroom door was now slightly open, the darkness inside yawning like a mouth. I edged toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. I pushed the door open with the flashlight, casting the beam into the bathroom. It was empty, the shower curtain drawn, the tiles old and cracked. But the mirror above the sink was fogged over, as if someone had just taken a hot shower, and written in the condensation in long, dripping letters was a single word: leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, not bothering to pack or look back. I ran down the hallway, the lights flickering overhead, and practically fell into the elevator. The ride down felt like an eternity, the elevator creaking and groaning as it descended, the air thick and suffocating. When the doors finally opened, I sprinted across the lobby, not stopping until I was outside, gulping down the cold night air. I checked into another hotel down the street, one that was clean and bright and blessedly normal. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, sitting by the window and watching the lights of the city, trying to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, and overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the image of that face in the window, the desperate scratches in the closet. The next morning I went back to the Grandwood to check out. The same desk clerk was there, and he barely looked up as I handed him the key. "How was your stay?" he asked, in a tone that suggested he didn't really care. I hesitated, then decided against telling him what had happened. Instead, I asked, "Has anyone else complained about room 615? The clerk looked up then, his expression inscrutable. 615? He frowned. thumbing through a book on the desk. "We don't use that room anymore." I stared at him, confusion mixing with the lingering fear. "What do you mean? I was just there last night." He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. 615's been closed for years, ever since, well, there was an incident. A guest went missing, and we never found them. But no one should have checked you into that room. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out, the clerk's voice trailing off behind me. As I stepped outside, I glanced up at the building, scanning the rows of windows. There, on the 6th floor, the window to room 615 was dark. But just for a moment I thought I saw it again. The faint outline of a face, watching me from the other side of the glass. I left the city that day and never looked back, but sometimes late at night I think about the Grandwood in that room, and I wonder if the next person to check in will hear it too. The tap, tap, tap of someone still trying to get out. I'm not one to get easily rattled. I've been working night shifts as a paramedic for over a decade, and I've seen my fair share of unsettling things. Accidents, violence, and the kind of tragedies that keep you awake at night. So when I ended up in the city for a training conference and had to stay at a budget hotel, I wasn't too concerned. I just needed a place to crash, nothing fancy. The conference wrapped up late, and I was dead tired by the time I checked into the Riverside Inn. It was one of those no-name hotels tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, a place that probably hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. The lobby was dimly lit, the carpet worn, and the front desk clerk didn't bother to look up from his magazine as he handed me the key to room 419. I took the old-fashioned key and made my way up to the 4th floor. The hallway was long and narrow, with flickering lights that buzzed softly overhead. I found my room and pushed the door open, flicking on the light switch. The room was basic: a bed, a TV that looked like it belonged in a museum, and a small window overlooking the street below. I tossed my bag on the bed and went to take a shower, hoping to wash off the fatigue of the day. The water was lukewarm, the pressure weak, but it did the job. As I stepped out and wrapped a towel around myself, I noticed something odd. The bathroom mirror was fogged up, which wasn't strange in itself, but there were streaks running through the steam, like someone had wiped at it with a hand. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the last guest hadn't shut the bathroom door properly, and grabbed my toothbrush. When I wiped the mirror clean, I froze. There, behind my reflection, was a faint outline, just a shadowy figure standing in the doorway behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. I stared at the open door, the bedroom beyond still and silent. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Just my reflection now, wide-eyed and tense. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been up since dawn, sitting through long, boring lectures and drinking bad coffee. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. I finished up, got dressed, and sat on the bed to check my phone. The signal was weak, but I managed to pull up some emails before the screen went blank. No service. I tried the TV, but it was all static. Every channel the same, a hiss of white noise, like it was trying to pick up a signal from somewhere far away. I sighed and tossed the remote aside, deciding I'd just go to bed and get some rest. I'd be up early to catch my flight home anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. I was drifting off when the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, the hum of the AC cutting off abruptly. I sat up, disoriented, and fumbled for my phone, using it as a flashlight. The whole floor seemed to be out, the hallway outside my room completely dark. I figured it was just a blown fuse or a citywide blackout, nothing to panic about. I sat on the edge of the bed waiting for the lights to come back on when I heard it. A soft thump, followed by the creak of a door opening somewhere down the hall. I stepped out into the corridor, the beam of my phone cutting through the darkness. The emergency lights hadn't kicked in, and the only sound was the distant drip of water from a leaky pipe. I called out, but my voice sounded small and lost in the dark. No answer, just the echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I started to walk, the floor creaking underfoot, the sound of my own footsteps unnervingly loud. Room doors lined the walls, each one shut tight, and the air was thick and stale, like it hadn't been circulated in years. As I neared the end of the hall, I noticed one door slightly ajar, room 422. The door was open just a crack, a thin sliver of darkness beyond. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper too soft to make out coming from inside the room. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to go back to my room and wait for the power to come back on, but I've always been too curious for my own good. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, shining my phone's light around the room. It was empty. Same layout as mine, same tired furniture, but the bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and stained. The air was colder in here, biting against my skin, and I noticed that the window was open, the curtains billowing slightly in the breeze. I walked over, peering out, but the street below was empty, just the occasional flicker of headlights from distant cars. Then I heard it again, that faint whisper, this time closer, like it was right behind me. I turned around, shining the light, but the room was still empty. My pulse quickened as I backed toward the door, the sense of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. I stepped out into the hall, pulling the door shut behind me, and nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw someone standing at the end of the corridor. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair hanging limp around her face. She was facing away from me, her figure illuminated faintly by the light from my phone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, just stood there, her shoulders rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. I took a step closer, and as I did, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and vacant, and her mouth moved like she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, without warning, she turned and walked through the door of room 422, the door closing silently behind her. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stick around to see if she'd come back out. I bolted down the hall back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat there back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart, but the whisper started again, faint and insistent, like a chorus of voices rising from the walls. I grabbed my things and decided I was done. I wasn't staying in that room or in that hotel for another second. I made my way down the pitch-black stairwell, my phone barely lighting the way, and burst into the lobby. It was empty, the front desk abandoned, and the main doors were propped open, letting in the cold night air. I didn't see the clerk, and I didn't care. I walked out, the hotel's lights flickering faintly as I stepped onto the street. I found another place a few blocks away, a bright, modern hotel where the power was still on and the lobby was bustling with people. I booked a room and spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, unable to sleep, staring at the Riverside Inn's dark outline in the distance. The next morning, I went back to the Riverside to check out. The power was back on, the lobby lit up like nothing had happened. The same desk clerk was there, looking as uninterested as ever. "I'm checking out early," I said, sliding the key across the counter. "The power went out last night and I'm just done." He looked up, his expression finally shifting, but not in the way I expected. His brow furrowed and he leaned in, squinting at me. "There wasn't a power outage," he said slowly. "Everything's been fine all night. And, sir," he paused, glancing at his computer screen, "we don't have a room 422. I stared at him, my stomach sinking. "What are you talking about? I was there. I saw—" He cut me off, his face pale. "That room was sealed off years ago. There was an incident. A guest went missing and they never found them. Room 422 has been closed ever since. It's not supposed to be open. No one's supposed to be in there." I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked out, my mind racing with the impossible truth. As I stepped outside, I glanced up at the 4th floor. There, in the window of room 422, I saw her. The woman in the nightgown, staring down at me with those vacant eyes, her mouth moving silently. I turned and left, vowing never to set foot in that part of the city again. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I still hear it. That faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass, and the soft murmur of voices just beyond the door. The Riverside Inn is still there, still taking in weary travelers who don't know the stories. but I do. And I know that some rooms once entered never really let you leave. I never really liked staying at other people's houses. There's something about being in someone else's space that always felt off to me, like the walls were watching, holding secrets you weren't supposed to uncover. But when my old college friend Rachel invited me to her new place for the weekend, I figured I could make an exception. She'd just moved into an old Victorian house in a small town upstate, and she was excited to show it off. Plus, we hadn't seen each other in years, and I thought it'd be nice to catch up. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Rachel's house was impressive, towering and ornate, with gabled roofs and dark windows that reflected the fading daylight like dead eyes. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, beautiful but imposing, and more than a little eerie. Rachel greeted me at the door with a big smile, her excitement infectious. She gave me a quick tour, showing off the old woodwork, the original fixtures, and the little quirks that came with owning a house that was over a century old. I admired it all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, like it was listening in on every word. "Your room's upstairs," Rachel said, leading me to a narrow staircase that creaked under our feet. "It's not much, but it's cozy." She opened the door to the guest room, and I stepped inside. It was a small room, just big enough for a bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. The wallpaper was old, faded with delicate floral patterns that had long since lost their color. A heavy, antique mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed, its glass slightly warped and tarnished. "It's perfect," I lied, smiling at Rachel. She beamed back at me, and I didn't have the heart to tell her the room made me uneasy. There was something about the mirror, the way it seemed to dominate the space, reflecting everything in the room with a strange, distorted clarity. We spent the evening catching up, sharing wine and reminiscing about old times. It was easy, slipping back into the familiar rhythms of our friendship, and for a while I forgot about the house and the strange feeling it gave me. But as the night wore on, the wind picked up outside, howling against the windows, and I felt that creeping unease return. Rachel finally showed me to bed around midnight, her footsteps echoing softly down the hall as she wished me good night. I closed the door and turned to face the room, my eyes drawn immediately to the mirror. It was like it was daring me to look, to see something that wasn't there. I got ready for bed, trying to ignore the mirror's presence, but every time I glanced at it, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light, and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up tight. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I was drifting off when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly knocking on wood. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room, but everything was still. I listened, holding my breath, and the tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the mirror. I stared at the mirror, my pulse quickening, but all I saw was my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe something loose in the walls, but the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but the sound seemed to seep into my ears, insistent and unrelenting. I peeked out from under the covers, my eyes locked on the mirror. That's when I saw it, a faint outline like a shadow moving behind the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure took shape. It was a woman, tall and thin, her hair hanging limp and wet around her face. Her eyes were dark and hollow, staring straight at me, and her mouth moved soundlessly, like she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I blinked and she was gone, just my reflection staring back at me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just behind the glass watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the light on and sat in bed, my eyes darting between the mirror and the door, waiting for something to happen. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows, and the tapping continued, echoing through the silence like a heartbeat. The next morning, Rachel found me in the kitchen, bleary-eyed and clutching a cup of coffee. She laughed it off when I told her about the mirror, saying the house was old and probably just needed a few repairs. "Old houses make noise," she said, brushing it off with a smile. "Besides, I thought you didn't believe in ghosts." I forced a laugh, trying to match her lightheartedness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to leave that day, making up an excuse about work and promising to visit again soon. Rachel seemed disappointed, but she hugged me goodbye and told me I was always welcome. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house, its dark windows watching me leave. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, like I was abandoning something or someone behind. Weeks passed and life went back to normal. I didn't think much about the house or the mirror, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and lack of sleep. But then I got a call from Rachel. She sounded off, her voice tight and strained, like she hadn't slept in days. "Have you been seeing things?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" "The mirror," she said, her voice cracking. "It's been different since you left. I keep seeing her, that woman you talked about. I thought it was just stress, but last night..." She trailed off, and I could hear her breath hitch on the other end of the line. "What happened?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "She was in my room," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking, "standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me. I turned on the light and she was gone. But the mirror..." Rachel's voice broke, and I heard a soft sob. The mirror was covered in water, like someone had been pressing against it from the inside. I didn't know what to say. I told her to leave, to get out of the house and stay somewhere else, but she just laughed weakly, saying it was probably just stress and she was imagining things. But I could hear the fear in her voice, the disbelief mingled with the creeping realization that it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. A few days later, Rachel stopped responding to my texts. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove up to her house, but it was dark, the windows empty and lifeless. I knocked, called out, but there was no answer. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, the musty air greeting me like a cold, damp shroud. The house was quiet, too quiet, and my footsteps echoed in the empty halls. I found Rachel's bedroom at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was in disarray, the bed unmade, clothes strewn across the floor. But what caught my attention was the mirror. It was cracked, jagged lines spidering across the glass, and the surface was covered in streaks of water like tears. And there, just barely visible through the fractured glass, was a figure, a faint, shadowy outline, staring back at me from the other side. Rachel was never found. The police ruled it a disappearance, one of those cases that would remain unsolved, with no clues and no leads. But I knew what happened. I knew she was still there, trapped behind the glass with the woman who had watched me that night. I left Rachel's house and never went back, but the image of that mirror haunts me still. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I catch glimpses of movement in reflections, just a flicker out of the corner of my eye. And I know deep down that it's her. Still trapped, still watching, waiting for someone else to see her. When I was younger, my family lived in a small rural town in the Midwest. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and most of the town's history was passed down through whispered stories and local legends. One of the most enduring tales was about the old mill on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling relic of the town's past, and everyone said it was haunted. The story went that the mill had once been run by a man named Samuel Blythe, a recluse who kept to himself and was known for his bad temper. They said he'd gone mad one winter, locking himself inside the mill and refusing to leave. No one knows exactly what happened, but one day the mill's grinding stopped, and Samuel was never seen again. When the townsfolk finally broke down the doors, they found the place empty, except for strange symbols scrawled on the walls and floors. People said Samuel had been trying to summon something, and whatever he'd called up never left. I didn't believe the stories. At 14, I was all about proving I wasn't scared of anything, and I thought the ghost stories were just old wives' tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But when my friends dared me to spend a night at the old mill, I couldn't say no. It was a stupid dare, one that I knew would be easy to win. I just had to stay until sunrise. We set out just after sunset, my friends laughing and joking as we biked through the overgrown paths that led to the mill. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the darkening sky. The windows were boarded up, and the once red paint had long since faded to a dull, peeling gray. The air around the mill felt heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides, but I brushed it off as nerves. They dropped me off at the entrance, handing me a flashlight and a sleeping bag. "See you in the morning," they called, their laughter echoing in the stillness as they rode away, leaving me alone with the mill and the creeping night. I pushed open the creaky, rotting door and stepped inside. The air was cold, musty, and the faint scent of mold and old wood filled my nose. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing old machinery, rusted gears, and piles of debris. I picked a corner, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for what I hoped would be a boring night. At first, it was just like any other old building, quiet, the kind of stillness that comes from years of abandonment. But as the night wore on, I started to hear things. Soft, almost imperceptible sounds. The creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of something moving in the dark. I told myself it was just the wind, the building settling, or maybe rats. But then, the tapping started. It was faint at first, a light, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the empty space. I shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing, just the broken remnants of the mill. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking on wood, and it seemed to be coming from the old grinding wheel in the center of the room. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and moved closer. The wheel was massive, ancient, and covered in grime. As I reached it, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move. A shadow, darting just out of view, slipping between the rusted beams of the mill. I spun around, the beam of my light shaking as I tried to catch another glimpse of it. But the room was still. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and turned back to my sleeping bag. That's when I saw them, the symbols, the same ones the townsfolk had talked about, carved into the wood around the grinding wheel. They were crude, jagged, and they seemed to pulse under the light, like they were alive. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my eyes scanning the room. I could feel something, a presence, watching me from the shadows. I wanted to leave, to bolt out the door and forget about the stupid dare. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I turned my back, whatever was in the mill would be right behind me. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath fogging in the air. The flashlight flickered again, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching and twisting across the floor. I heard it then, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing, like a voice trying to break through the static. I strained to listen, but the words were garbled, lost in the hum of the mill. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. I could feel the floor vibrate under my feet, the machinery groaning to life with a low, grinding noise. I backed toward the door, my flashlight flickering wildly, and the symbols on the grinding wheel started to glow. A faint, sickly green that cast eerie shadows across the room. That's when I saw it, the shadow, darker than the others, standing by the grinding wheel. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs stretched and contorted in unnatural angles. Its eyes were just empty voids, and it stared at me with a malevolence that sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. I didn't think, I just ran. I bolted through the door, not looking back, the whispers following me out into the night. My feet pounded against the dirt path, heart racing as I sprinted through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. My friends found me the next morning huddled on my front porch, my face pale and eyes wide. They laughed at first, thinking I'd just chickened out. But when they saw the look on my face, their smiles faded. I tried to tell them what happened, but the words wouldn't come. I just shook my head and told them I'd never set foot near that mill again. A few weeks later, the town decided to demolish the old mill. Too many kids sneaking in, they said. Too dangerous. They brought in a crew, tore it down, and filled the site with gravel and new construction. But even now, years later, when I pass by that spot, I swear I can still hear it. The faint rhythmic tapping echoing in the distance. And in the quietest moments, when the wind dies down and the town is still, I can almost make out the whispers, the voices of those who never left. I've worked in building maintenance for most of my life. Office buildings, hospitals, schools, you name it, I've fixed it. There's a strange comfort in the hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet of empty hallways after hours, the sense of control that comes from knowing every creak and groan of a structure. But there's one building I worked in that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was an old high-rise downtown, built in the 1920s, with a reputation for being haunted. The building had been abandoned for years, left to decay as the city expanded around it. I was part of a team brought in to start renovations, with plans to turn the place into luxury apartments. It was a big job, but I liked the challenge. There was something fascinating about peeling back the layers of time, revealing the history hidden behind the walls. From the first day, the place felt off. The building was eerily silent and the air was stale, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floors creaked with every step, and the windows were thick with grime. But what really unnerved me was the sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickle on the back of my neck, a flicker in the corner of my eye. But as the days went on, the feeling grew stronger. One afternoon, while we were clearing out debris on the 12th floor, I noticed something odd. My blueprint didn't match the layout of the floor. There was a gap where there shouldn't be, a dead space that wasn't accounted for on the plans. I walked the length of the corridor, counting doors and measuring distances, but no matter how many times I checked, there was still a missing section. Curious, I tapped on the walls, listening for a hollow sound, something that might indicate a hidden room or a false partition. After a few minutes, I found it, a spot near the end of the hallway where the wall sounded different. I ran my hand along the faded wallpaper, feeling for any seams, and eventually, I found a small crack. I pulled out my utility knife and carefully cut along the edge, peeling back a section of the wall to reveal a door. It was old, much older than the rest of the building. The wood was dark and heavy, and the handle was a tarnished brass that had long since lost its shine. There was no sign, no room number, just a door where none should have been. I hesitated for a moment, the hair on my arm standing on end, but curiosity got the better of me. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was like stepping into another world. It was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting long, warped shadows on the walls. The air was cold, much colder than the rest of the building, and it smelled faintly of damp and something sweet like rotting fruit. The room was furnished like an office from the 1920s, a heavy wooden desk, a leather chair, and shelves lined with dusty books and faded papers. A large, ornate mirror hung on one wall, its surface tarnished and speckled with age. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, like no one had been in there for decades. But what struck me most was the sense of wrongness, like the room was stuck in time, preserved in a way that felt unnatural. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and walked over to the desk. There were papers scattered across the surface, old memos, handwritten notes, and sketches of building plans. I picked one up, squinting to read the faded ink, but the words didn't make sense. They were written in some kind of shorthand, with symbols and numbers that looked like a code. As I set the paper down, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, and my reflection stared back at me from the mirror. But something was off. It wasn't just the tarnished glass. It was the way my reflection moved, slightly out of sync with me, like a delayed echo. I took a step closer, my reflection doing the same, but the delay grew more pronounced, a fraction of a second too slow. I raised my hand, and my reflection raised its hand, but the wrong one. It was a small difference, but it sent a jolt of cold fear through me. I took another step forward, and my reflection stepped back, the movement fluid but wrong, like it was acting on its own. My breath fogged the glass, and I wiped it away, my hand trembling. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just behind me, half hidden in the shadows of the room. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face gaunt and eyes sunken. He stared at me through the mirror, unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grimace. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, closer now, his reflection looming over my shoulder. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the man's expression changed, his grimace stretching into a wide, unnatural smile. The light flickered, and the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in like they were breathing. I bolted for the door, slamming it behind me, my pulse hammering in my ears. I leaned against the wall, gasping for air, and stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But it remained shut, the corridor silent once more. I told my supervisor about the room, about the door that wasn't on the plans. He frowned, said he'd look into it, but when I returned the next day, the door was gone. The wall was perfectly intact, no sign of the crack I'd found, no hidden room, just a smooth stretch of wallpaper that matched the rest of the hall. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd stumbled into an old storage room or a maintenance closet, but no matter how many times I walked that hallway, I couldn't find it again. The building continued to feel off, the sense of being watched never quite leaving me, but I pushed through, finishing the job without any more incidents. It wasn't until weeks later, after the renovations were complete and the new tenants had moved in, that I heard the news. A woman on the 12th floor had called emergency services, claiming she was trapped in a room that didn't exist. The call was frantic, her voice breaking up, and then it cut off abruptly. When the rescue team arrived, they found her apartment empty, the door locked from the inside. She was never found. The official story was that she'd had a mental breakdown, wandered off, or left of her own accord. But I knew the truth. The building had secrets, rooms that shouldn't be there, places that didn't belong, and something in that old mirror had been watching, waiting. I quit the job soon after and moved to another city far away from that high-rise. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow that doesn't belong, a reflection that doesn't quite match. And I know deep down that the lost floor is still out there, hidden in the spaces we can't see, waiting for someone else to stumble in. And whoever does might not be as lucky as I was to find their way out.